James Baldwin. Part 1. The seventh day. And the Spirit and the bride say, Come. And let him that heareth say, Come. And let him that is athirst come. And whosoever will, let him take the water of life freely. I looked down the line, and I wondered. Everyone had always said that John would be a preacher when he grew up, just like his father. It has been so often that John, without ever thinking about it, had come to believe it himself. Not until the morning of his 14th birthday did he really begin to think about it, and by then it was already too late. His earliest memories, which were in a way his only memories, were of the hurry and brightness of Sunday mornings. They all rose together on that day. His father, who did not have to go to work and led them in prayer before breakfast. His mother, who dressed up on that day and looked almost young with her hair straightened, and on her head the close-fitting white cap that was the uniform of holy women. His younger brother, Roy, who was silent that day because his father was home. Sarah, who wore a red ribbon in her hair that day and was fondled by her father. And the baby, Ruth, who was dressed in pink and white and rode in her mother's arms to church. The church was not very far away, for block up Lenox Avenue, on a corner not far from the hospital. It was to this hospital that his mother had gone when Roy and Sarah and Ruth were born. John did not remember very clearly the first time she had gone to have Roy. Folks said that he had cried and carried on the whole time his mother was away. He remembered only enough to be afraid every time her belly began to swell, knowing that each time the swelling began it would not end until she was taken from him, to come back with a stranger. Each time this happened, she became a little more of a stranger herself. She would soon be going away again, Roy said. He knew much more about such things than John. John had observed his mother closely, seeing no swelling yet, but his father had prayed one morning for the little voyager soon to be among them. And so John knew that Roy spoke the truth. Every Sunday morning, then, since John could remember, they had taken to the streets the Grimes family on their way to church. Sinners along the avenue watched him. Men still wearing their Sunday night clothes, wrinkled and dusty now, muddy-eyed and muddy-faced. And the women with harsh voices and tight, bright dresses, cigarettes between their finger or held tightly in the corners of their mouths. They talked and laughed and fought together, and the women fought like the men. John and Roy, passing these men and women, looked at one another briefly, John embarrassed and Roy amused. Roy would be like them when he grew up, if the Lord did not change his heart. These men and women they passed on Sunday mornings had spent the night in bars, or in cat houses, or on the streets, or on the rooftops, or under the stairs. They had been drinking. They had gone from cursing to laughter, to anger, to lust. Once he and Roy had watched a man and woman in the basement of a condemned house. They did it standing up. The woman had wanted 50 cents, and the man had flashed a razor. John had never watched again. He had been afraid. But Roy had watched them many times, and he told John he had done it with some girls down the block. And his mother and father, who went to church on Sundays, they did it too, and sometimes John heard them in the bedroom behind him, over the sound of rats' feet and rat screams, and the music and cursing from the harlot's house downstairs. Their church was called the Temple of the Fire Baptized. It was not the biggest church in Harlem, not yet the smallest, but John had been brought up to believe it was the holiest and best. His father was head deacon in this church. There were only two, the other a round, black man named Deacon Braithwaite, and he took up the collection and sometimes he preached. The pastor, Father James, was a genial, well-fed man with a face like a darker moon. It was he who preached on Pentecost Sundays and led revivals in the summertime and anointed and healed the sick. On Sunday mornings and Sunday nights, the church was always full. On special Sundays, it was full all day. The Grimes family arrived in a body, always a little late, usually in the middle of Sunday school, which began at 9 o'clock. This lateness was always their mother's fault.
Do you get paid for streaming with?
Just a little bit. I'm still for now just making some payments.
Somebody with me.
Okay.
Yeah.
Gotta go.
Hey.
Go, go, go.
Grenade out. Cover going out.
Oh.
Loading.
Spike planted.
Reloading. Suppressing. One suppressed.
You broke it.
One enemy remaining.
Oh,
Last
no.
player standing.
Shit. Where?
تحت
Oh
الواحد.
my god.
تحت الواحد.
مين؟
قبلت كي غاد قبلت فهم.
There. Oh,
تعرف تلعب نيون.
nice try. Nice try, nice try.
نيون تعرف تلعب.
Fight is a lesson.
بالله يقول له يسكر فمه ولا نبدا نسب يمين ويسار انا تو.
Wait, I will.
Man, can you at least be a little bit positive, man? Please.
At least in the eyes of their
Just go
father.
AFK.
She could not seem to get herself and the children ready on time, ever, and sometimes she actually remained behind, not to appear until the morning service. When they all arrived together, they separated upon entering the doors, father and mother going to sit in the adult class, which was taught by Sister McCandless, Sarah going to the infants class, John and Roy sitting in the intermediate, which was taught by Brother Alicia. You got a special craving for something? John looked at him. Roy was not in a good mood. I ain't said nothing to you, he said. Oh, I beg your pardon, said Roy in the shrill little girl tone he knew John hated. What's the matter with you today? John asked, angry, and trying at the same time to lend his voice as husky a pitch as possible. Don't you let Roy bother you, said their mother. He cross as 2 sticks this morning. Yeah, said John. I reckon. He and Roy watched each other.
Enemy remaining.
Then his plate was put before him, hominy grits and a scrap of bacon. He wanted to cry, like a child. But, Mama, it's my birthday. He kept his eyes on his plate and began to eat. You can talk about your daddy all you want to, said his mother, picking up her battle with Roy. But one thing you can't say he ain't always done his best to be a father to you and to see to it that you ain't never gone hungry. I've been hungry plenty of times, Roy said, proud to be able to score this point against his mother. Wasn't his fault, then. Wasn't because he wasn't trying to feed you. Then man shoveled snow in zero weather when he ought to been in bed just to put food in your belly. Wasn't just my belly, said Roy indignantly. He got a belly too, I know. It's a shame the way that man eats. I sure ain't asked him to shovel no snow for me. But he dropped his eyes, suspecting a flaw in his argument. I just don't want him beating on me all the time, he said at last. I ain't no dog. She sighed and turned slightly away, looking out of the window. Your daddy beats you, she said, because he loves you. Roy laughed. That ain't the kind of love I understand, old lady. What you reckon he'd do if he didn't love me? He'd let you go right on, she flashed. Right on down to hell where it looks like you is just determined to go anyhow. Right on, Mr. Man, till somebody puts a knife in you or takes you off to jail. Mama, John asked suddenly, is Daddy a good man? He had not known that he was going to ask the question, and he watched in astonishment as her mouth tightened and her eyes grew dark. That ain't no kind of question, she said mildly. You don't know no better men, do you? Looks to me like he's a mighty good man, said Sarah. He sure is praying all the time. You children is young, their mother said, ignoring Sarah and sitting down again at the table. And you don't know how lucky you is to have a father what worries about you and tries to see to it that you come up right. Yeah, said Roy. We don't know how lucky we is to have a father what don't want you to go to movies, and don't want you to play in the streets, and don't want you to have no friends, and he don't want this and he don't want that, and he don't want you to do nothing. We so lucky to have a father who just wants us to go to church and read the Bible and beller like a fool in front of the altar and stay home all nice and quiet, like a little mouse. Boy, we sure is lucky, all right. Don't know what I done to be so lucky. She laughed. You going to find out one day, she said. You mark my words. Yeah, said Roy. But it'll be too late then, she said. It'll be too late when you come to be sorry. Her voice had changed. For a moment her eyes met John's eyes, and John was frightened. He felt that her words, after the strange fashion God sometimes chose to speak to men, were dictated by heaven and were meant for him. He was 14, was it too late? and thus uneasiness was reinforced by the impression, which at that moment he realized had been his all along, that his mother was not saying everything she meant. What, he wondered, did she say to Aunt Florence when they talked together? Or to his father? What were her thoughts? Her face would never tell. And yet, looking down at him in a moment that was like a secret passing sign, her face did tell him. Her thoughts were bitter. I don't care, Roy said, rising. When I have children, I ain't going to treat them like this. John watched his mother. She watched Roy. I'm sure this ain't no way to be. Ain't got no right to have a house full of children if you don't know how to treat them. You mighty grown up this morning, his mother said. You be careful. And tell me something else, Roy said, suddenly leaning over his mother. Tell me how come he don't never let me talk to him like I talk to you? He's my father, ain't he? But he don't never listen to me. No, I all the time got to listen to him. Your father, she said, watching him, knows best. You listen to your father. I guarantee you won't end up in no jail. Roy sucked his teeth in fury. I ain't looking to go to no jail. You think that's all that's in the world is jails and churches? You ought to know better than that, Ma. I know, she said. There ain't no safety except you walk humble before the Lord. You gonna find it out, too, one day. You go on hardhead. You going to come to grief. And suddenly Rot grinned. But you be there, won't you, Ma, when I'm in trouble? You don't know, she said, trying not to smile. How long the Lord's going to let me stay with you? Roy turned and did a dance step. That's all right, he said. I know the Lord ain't as hard as Daddy. Is he, boy? He demanded of John, and struck him lightly on the forehead. Boy, let me eat my breakfast, John muttered, though his plate had long been empty, and he was pleased that Roy had turned to him. That sure is a crazy boy, ventured Sarah soberly. Just listen, cried Roy. To the little Saint One, Daddy ain't never going to have trouble with her. That one, she was born holy. I bet the first words she ever said was, Thank you, Jesus. Ain't that so, Ma? You stop this foolishness, she said, laughing, and go on about your work. Can't nobody play the fool with you all morning. Oh, is you got work for me to do this morning? Well, I declare, said Roy. What you got for me to do? I got the woodwork in the dining room for you to do. And you going to do it, too, before you set foot out of this house. Now, why you want to talk like that, Ma? Is I said I wouldn't do it? You know I'm a right good worker when I got a mind. After I do it, can I go? You go ahead and do it and we'll see. You better do it right. I always do it right, said Roy. You won't know your old woodwork when I get through. John, said his mother, you sweep the front room for me like a good boy and dust the furniture. I'm gonna clean up in here. Yes'm, he said and rose. She had forgotten about his birthday. He swore he would not mention it. He would not think about it any more. To sweep the front room meant, principally, to sweep the heavy red and green and purple Oriental-style carpet that had once been that room's glory, but was now so faded that it was all one swimming color, and so frayed in places that it tangled with the broom. John hated sweeping this carpet, for dust rose, clogging his nose and sticking to his sweaty skin, and he felt that should be sweep it forever. The clouds of dust would not diminish, the rug would not be clean. It became in his imagination his impossible, lifelong task, his hard trial, like that of a man he had read about somewhere, whose curse it was to push a boulder up a steep hill, only to have the giant who guarded the hill roll the boulder down again, and so on, forever throughout eternity. He was still out there, that hapless man, somewhere at the other end of the earth, pushing his boulder up the hill. He had John's entire sympathy, for the longest and hardest part of his Saturday mornings was his voyage with the broom across this endless rug, and coming to the French doors that ended the living room and stopped the rug, he felt like an indescribably weary traveler who sees his home at last. Yet for each dustpan he so laboriously filled at the door still demons added to the rug 20 more. He saw in the expanse behind him the dust that he had raised settling again into the carpet, and he gritted his teeth, already on edge because of the dust that filled his mouth, and nearly wept to Thinel that so much labor brought so little reward. Nor was this the end of John's labor. For, having put away the broom and the dustpan, he took from the small bucket under the sink the dust rag and the furniture oil and a damp cloth, and returned to the living room to excavate, as it were, from the dust that threatened to bury them, his family's goods and gear. Thinking bitterly of his birthday, he attacked the mirror with the cloth, watching his face appear as out of a cloud. With a shock he saw that his face had not changed, that the hand of Satan was as yet invisible. His father had always said that his face was the face of Satan, and was there not something, in the lift of the eyebrow, in the way his rough hair formed a V on his brow, that bore witness to his father's words? In the eye there was a light that was not the light of heaven, and the mouth trembled lustful and lewd, to drink deep of the wines of hell. He stared at his face as though it were, as indeed it soon appeared to be, the face of a stranger who held secrets that John could never know. And, having thought of it as the face of a stranger, he tried to look at it as a stranger might, and tried to discover what other people saw. But he saw only details. 2 great eyes, and a broad, low forehead, and the triangle of his nose, and his enormous mouth, and the barely perceptible cleft in his chin, which was, his father said, the mark of the devil's little finger. These details did not help him, for the principle of their unity was undiscoverable, and he could not tell what he most passionately desired to know, whether his face was ugly or not. And he dropped his eyes to the mantelpiece, lifting one by one the objects that adorned it. The mantelpiece held, in brave confusion, photographs, greeting cards, flowered mottos, 2 silver candlesticks that held no candles, and a green metal serpent, poised to strike. Today, in his apathy, John stared at them, not seeing. He began to dust them with exaggerated care of the profoundly preoccupied. One of the mottos was pink and blue, and proclaimed in raised letters, which made the work of dusting harder. Come in the evening, or come in the morning. Come when you're looked for, or come without warning. 1,000 welcomes you'll find here before you, and the oftener you come here, the more we'll adore you. And the other, in letters of fire against a background of gold, stated, For God so loved the world, that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever should believe in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. John 3:16. These somewhat unrelated sentiments decorated either side of the mantelpiece, obscured a little by the silver candlesticks. Between these 2 extremes, the greeting cards, received year after year on Christmas or Easter or birthdays, trumpeted their glad tidings, while the green metal serpent, perpetually malevolent, raised its head proudly in the midst of these trophies, biding the time to strike. Against the mirror, like a procession, the photographs were arranged. These photographs were the true antiques of the family, which seemed to feel that a photograph should commemorate only the most distant past. The photographs of John and Roy, and of the 2 girls, which seemed to violate this unspoken law, served only in fact to prove it most iron-hard. They had all been taken in infancy, a time and a condition that the children could not remember. John in this photograph sat naked on a white counterpane, and people laughed and said that it was cunning. But John could never look at it without feeling shame and anger that his nakedness should be here so unkindly revealed. None of the other children was naked. No, Roy lay in the crib in a white gown and grinned toothlessly into the camera, and Sarah, somber at the age of 6 months, wore a white bonnet, and Ruth was held in her mother's arms. When people looked at these photographs and laughed, their laughter differed from the laughter with which they greeted the naked John. For this reason, when visitors tried to make advances to John, he was sullen, and they, feeling that for some reason he disliked them, retaliated by deciding that he was a funny child. Among the other photographs there was one of Aunt Florence, his father's sister, in which her hair, in the old-fashioned way, was worn high and tied with a ribbon. She had been very young when his photograph was taken, and had just come north. Sometimes, when she came to visit, she called the photograph to witness that she had indeed been beautiful in her youth. There was a photograph of his mother, not the one John liked and had seen only once, but one taken immediately after her marriage. And there was a photograph of his father, dressed in black, sitting on a country porch with his hands folded heavily in his lap. The photograph had been taken on a sunny day, and the sunlight brutally exaggerated the planes of his father's face. He stared into the sun, head raised, unbearable, and though it had been taken when he was young, it was not the face of a young man. Only something archaic in the dress indicated that this photograph had been taken long ago. At the time this picture was taken, Aunt Florence said, he was already a preacher, and had a wife who was now in heaven. That he had been a preacher at that time was not astonishing, for it was impossible to imagine that he had ever been anything else. But that he had had a wife in the so distant past who was now dead filled John with wonder by no means pleasant. If she had lived, John thought, then he would never have come north and met his mother. And this shadowy woman, dead so many years, whose name he knew had been Deborah, held in the fastness of her tomb. It seemed to John, the key to all those mysteries he so longed to unlock. It was she who had known his father in a life where John was not, and in a country John had never seen. When he was nothing, nowhere, dust, cloud, air and sun and falling rain. Not even thought of, said his mother. In heaven with the angels, said his aunt. She had known his father and shared his father's house. She had loved his father. She had known his father when lightning flashed and thunder rolled through heaven. And his father said, "Listen, God is talking." She had known him in the mornings of that far-off country when his father turned on his bed and opened his eyes. And she had looked into those eyes, seeing what they held, and she had not been afraid. She had seen him baptized, kicking like a mule and howling, and she had seen him weep when his mother died. He was a right young man then, Florence said, because she had looked into those eyes before they had looked on John. She knew that John would never know the purity of his father's eyes when John was not reflected in their depths. She could have told him, had he but been able form his hiding place to ask how to make his father love him. But now it was too late. She would not speak before the judgment day. And among those many voices, the stammering with his own, John would care no longer for her testimony. When he had finished and the room was ready for Sunday, John felt dusty and weary and sat down beside the window in his father's easy chair. A glacial sun filled the streets, and a high wind filled the air with scraps of paper and frost dust, and banged the hanging signs of stores and storefront churches. It was the end of winter, and the garbage-filled snow that had been banked along the edges of pavements was melting now and filling the gutters. Boys were playing stickball in the damp, cold streets. Dressed in heavy woolen sweaters and heavy trousers, they danced and shouted, and the ball went crack as the stick struck it and sent ice speeding through the air. One of them wore a bright red stocking cap with a great ball of wool hanging down behind that bounced as he jumped, like a bright omen above his head. The cold sun made their faces like copper and brass, and through the closed window John heard their coarse, irreverent voices. And he wanted to be one of them, playing in the streets, unfrightened, moving with such grace and power. But he knew this could not be. Yet, if he could not play their games, he could do something they could not do. He was able, as one of his teachers said, to think. But this brought him little in the way of consolation, for today he was terrified of his thoughts. He wanted to be with these boys in the street, headless and thoughtless, wearing out his treacherous and bewildering body. But now it was 11 o'clock, and in 2 hours his father would be home. And then they might eat, and then his father would lead them in prayer, and then he would give them a Bible lesson. By and by it would be evening, and he would go to clean the church, and remained for Tari service. Suddenly, sitting at the window, and with a violence unprecedented, there arose in John a flood of fury and tears, and he bowed his head, fists clenched against the window pane, crying with teeth on edge, "What shall I do? What shall I do?" Then his mother called him, and he remembered that she was in the kitchen washing clothes and probably had something for him to do. He rose sullenly and walked into the kitchen. She stood over the washtub, her arms wet and soapy to the elbows and sweat standing on her brow. Her apron, improvised from an old sheet, was wet where she had been leaning over the scrubbing board. As he came in, she straightened, drying her hands on the edge of the apron. "You finish your work, John Backslash?" she asked. He said, "Yes'm," and thought how oddly she looked at him, as though she were looking at someone else's child. "That's a good boy," she said. She smiled a shy, strained smile. "You know you're your mother's right-hand man?" He said nothing, and he did not smile, but watched her, wondering to what task this preamble led. She turned away, passing one damp hand across her forehead, and went to the cupboard. Her back was to him, and he watched her while she took down a bright, figured vase, filled with flowers only on the most special occasions, and emptied the contents into her palm. He heard the chink of money, which meant that she was going to send him to the store. She put the vase back and turned to face him, her palm loosely folded before her. "I didn't never ask you," she said, "what you wanted for your birthday, but you take this, son, and go out and get yourself something you think you want." And she opened his palm and put the money into it, warm and wet from her hand. In the moment that he felt the warm, smooth coins and her hand on his, John stared blindly at her face, so far above him. His heart broke and he wanted to put his head on her belly where the wet spot was, and cry. but he dropped his eyes and looked at his palm, at the small pile of coins. "It ain't much there," she said. "That's all right." Then he looked up, and she bent down and kissed him on the forehead. "You getting to be," she said, putting her hand beneath his chin and holding his face away from her, "a right big boy. You're gonna be a mighty fine man, you know what? Your mama's counting on you." And he knew again that she was not saying everything she meant. In a kind of secret language, she was telling him today something that he must remember and understand tomorrow. He watched her face, his heart swollen with love for her and with an anguish, not yet his own, but he did not understand, and that frightened him. "Yes, Ma," he said, hoping that she would realize, despite his stammering tongue, the depth of his passion to please her. "I know," she said with a smile, releasing him and rising. "There's a whole lot of things you don't understand, but don't you fret. The Lord'll reveal to you in his own good time everything he wants you to know. You put your faith in the Lord, Johnny, and he'll surely bring you out. Everything works together for good for them that love the Lord." He had heard her say this before. It was her text, "As set thine house in order was his father's." But he knew that today she was saying it to him especially. She was trying to help him because she knew he was in trouble. And this trouble was also her own, which she would never tell to John. And even though he was certain that they could not be speaking of the same things, for then, surely, she would be angry and no longer proud of him. This perception on her part and his avowal of her love for him lent to John's bewilderment a reality that terrified and a dignity that consoled him. Dimly, he felt that he ought to console her, and he listened, astounded, at the words that now fell from his lips. "Yes, Mama. I'm going to try to love the Lord." At this there sprang into his mother's face something startling, beautiful, unspeakably sad, as though she were looking far beyond him at a long, dark road, and seeing on that road a traveler in perpetual danger. Was it he, the traveler, or herself? Or was she thinking of the cross of Jesus? She turned back to the washtub, still with this strange sadness on her face. "You better go on now," she said, "before your daddy gets home." In Central Park, the snow had not yet melted on his favorite hill. This hill was in the center of the park, after he had left the circle of the reservoir, where he always found, outside the high wall of crossed wire, ladies white in fur coats, walking their great dogs, or old white gentlemen with canes. At a point that he knew by instinct and by the shape of the buildings surrounding the park, he struck out on a steep path overgrown with trees, and climbed a short distance until he reached the clearing that led to the hill. Before him, then, the slope stretched upward, and above it the brilliant sky, and beyond it, cloudy and far away, he saw the skyline of New York. He did not know why, but there arose in him an exultation and a sense of power, and he ran up the hill like an engine or a madman, willing to throw himself headlong into the city that glowed before him. But when he reached the summit he paused. He stood on the crest of the hill, hands clasped beneath his chin, looking down. Then he, John, felt like a giant who might crumble the city with his anger. He felt like a tyrant who might crush the city beneath his heel. He felt like a long-awaited conqueror at whose feet flowers would be strewn, and before whom multitudes cried, "Hosanna!" He would be, of all, the mightiest, the most beloved, the Lord's anointed. And he would live in this shining city which his ancestors had seen with longing from far away. For it was his. The inhabitants of the city had told him it was his. He had but to run down, crying, and they would take him to their hearts and shew him wonders his eyes had never seen. And still, on the summit of that hill he paused. He remembered the people he had seen in that city, whose eyes held no love for him, and he thought of their feet so swift and brutal, and the dark gray clothes they wore, and how when they passed they did not see him, or, if they saw him, they smirked, and how the lights, unceasing, crashed on and off above him, and how he was a stranger there. Then he remembered his father and his mother and all the arms stretched out to hold him back, to save him from this city where, they said, his soul would find perdition. And certainly perdition sucked at the feet of the people who walked there, and cried in the lights in the gigantic towers. The marks of Satan could be found in the faces of the people who waited at the doors of movie houses. His words were printed on the great movie posters that invited people to sin. It was the roar of the damned that filled Broadway, where motor cars and buses and the hurrying people disputed every inch with death. Broadway, the way that led to death was broad, and many could be found thereon. But narrow was the way that led to life eternal, and few there were who found it. But he did not long for the narrow way, where all his people walked, where the houses did not rise, piercing, as it seemed, the unchanging clouds, but huddled, flat, ignoble, close to the filthy ground, where the streets and the hallways and the rooms were dark, and where the unconquerable odor was of dust, and sweat, and urine, and homemade gin. In the narrow way, the way of the cross, there awaited him only humiliation forever. There awaited him, one day, a house like his father's house, and a church like his father's, and a job like his father's, where he would grow old and black with hunger and toil. The way of the cross had given him a belly filled with wind and had bent his mother's back. They had never worn fine clothes, but here, where the buildings contested God's power and where the men and women did not fear God. Here he might eat and drink to his heart's content and clothe his body with wondrous fabrics, rich to the eye and pleasing to the touch. And then what of his soul, which would one day come to die and stand naked before the judgment bar? What would his conquest of the city profit him on that day? To hurl away, for a moment of ease, the glories of eternity. These glories were unimaginable, but the city was real. He stood for a moment on the melting snow, distracted, and then began to run down the hill, feeling himself fly as the descent became more rapid, and thinking, I can climb back up. If it's wrong, I can always climb back up. At the bottom of the hill, where the ground abruptly leveled off onto a gravel path, he nearly knocked down an old white man with a white beard, who was walking very slowly and leaning on his cane. They both stopped, astonished, and looked at one another. John struggled to catch his breath and apologize, but old man smiled. John smiled back. It was as though he and the old man had between them a great secret, and the old man moved on. The snow glittered in patches all over the park. Ice under the pale, strong sun melted slowly on the branches and trunks of trees. He came out of the park at Fifth Avenue where, as always, the old-fashioned horse carriages were lined along the curb, their drivers sitting on the high seats with rugs around their knees, or standing in twos and threes near the horses, stamping their feet and smoking pipes and talking. Summer he had seen people riding in these carriages, looking like people out of books, or out of movies in which everyone wore old-fashioned clothes and rushed at nightfall over frozen road, hotly pursued by their enemies who wanted to carry them back to death. Look back, had cried a beautiful woman with long blonde curls, and see if we are pursued. And she had come, as John remembered, to a terrible end. Now he stared at the horses, enormous and brown and patient, stamping every now and again a polished hoof, and he thought of what it would be like to have one day a horse of his own. He would call it Ryder, and mount it at morning when the grass was wet, and from the horse's back look out over great, sun-filled fields, his own. Behind him stood his house, great and rambling and very new, and in the kitchen his wife, a beautiful woman, made breakfast, and the smoke rose out of the chimney, melting into the morning air. They had children, who called him Papa and for whom at Christmas he bought electric trains. And he had turkeys and cows and chickens and geese, and other horses besides Ryder. They had a closet full of whiskey and wine. They had cars, but what church did they go to and what would he teach his children when they gathered around him in the evening? He looked straight ahead, down Fifth Avenue, where graceful women in fur coats walked, looking into the windows that held silk dresses and watches and rings. What church did they go to? And what were their houses like in the evening they took off these coats and these silk dresses and put their jewelry in a box and leaned back in soft beds to think for a moment before they slept of the day gone by? Did they read a verse from the Bible every night and fall on their knees to pray? But no, for their thoughts were not of God, and their way was not God's way. They were in the world, and of the world, and their feet laid hold on hell. Yet in school some of them had been nice to him, and it was hard to think of them burning in hell forever, they who were so gracious and beautiful now. Once, one winter when he had been very sick with a heavy cold that would not leave him, one of his teachers had bought him a bottle of cod liver oil, especially prepared with heavy syrup so that it did not taste so bad. This was surely a Christian act. His mother had said that God would bless that woman, and he had got better. They were kind, he was sire that they were kind, and on the day that he would bring himself to their attention they would surely love and honor him. This was not his father's opinion. His father said that all white people were wicked, and that God was going to bring them low. He said that white people were never to be trusted, and that they told nothing but lies, and that no one of them had ever loved a nigger. He, John, was a nigger, and he would find out, as soon as he got a little older, how evil white people could be. John had read about the things white people did to colored people. How in the South, where his parents came from, white people cheated them of their wages and burned them and shot them, and did worse things, said his father, which the tongue could not endure to utter. He had read about colored men being burned in the electric chair for things they had not done. How in riots they were beaten with clubs. How they were tortured in prisons. How they were the last to be hired and the first to be fired. Niggers did not live on these streets where John now walked. It was forbidden, and yet he walked here and no one raised a hand against him. But did he dare to enter this shop out of which a woman now casually walked, carrying a great round box? Or this apartment before which a white man stood, dressed in a brilliant uniform? John knew he did not dare, not today, and he heard his father's laugh. No, nor tomorrow neither. For him there was the back door and the dark stairs and the kitchen or the basement. This world was not for him. If he refused to believe and wanted to break his neck trying, then he could try until the sun refused to shine. They would never let him enter. In John's mind then, the people and the avenue underwent a change, and he feared them and knew that one day he could hate them if God did not change his heart. He left Fifth Avenue and walked west toward the movie houses. Here on 42nd Street it was less elegant but not less strange. He loved the street, not for the people or the shops but for the stone lions that guarded the great main building of the public library. A building filled with book and unimaginably vast, and which he had never yet dared to enter. He knew, for he was a member of the branch in Harlem and was entitled to take books from any library in the city. But he had never gone in because the building was so big that it must be full of corridors and marble steps, in the maze of which he would be lost and never find the book he wanted. And then everyone, all the white people inside, would know that he was not used to great buildings, or to many books, and they would look at him with pity. He would enter on another day when he had read all the books uptown, an achievement that would, he felt, lend him the poise to enter any building in the world. People, mostly men, leaned over the stone parapets of the raised park that surrounded the library, or walked up and bent to drink water from the public drinking fountains. Silver pigeons lighted briefly on the heads of the lions or the rims of fountains, and strutted along the walks. John loitered in front of Woolworth's, staring at the candy display, trying to decide what candy to buy, and buying. One, for the store was crowded and he was certain that the salesgirl would never notice him, and before a vendor of artificial flowers and crossed 6th Avenue where the automat was and the park taxis and the shops which he would not look at today, that displayed in their windows dirty postcards and practical jokes. Beyond 6th Avenue the movie houses began, and now he studied the stills carefully, trying to decide which of all these theaters he should enter. He stopped at last before a gigantic, colored poster that represented a wicked woman, half undressed, leaning in a doorway, apparently quarreling with a blond man who stared wretchedly into the street. The legend above their heads was, "There's a fool like him in every family, and a woman next door to take him over." He decided to see this, for he felt identified with the blond young man, the fool of his family, and he wished to know more about his so blatantly unkind fate. And so he stared at the price above the ticket seller's window and, showing her his coins, received the piece of paper that was charged with the power to open doors. Having once decided to enter, he did not look back at the street again for fear that one of the saints might be passing and, seeing him, might cry out his name and lay hands on him to drag him back. He walked very quickly across the carpeted lobby, looking at nothing, and pausing only to see his ticket torn, half of it thrown into a silver box and half returned to him. And then the usherette opened the doors of this dark palace, and with a flashlight held behind her took him to his seat. Not even then, having pushed past a wilderness of knees and feet to reach his designated seat, did he dare to breathe. Nor, out of a last sick hope for forgiveness, did he look at the screen. He stared at the darkness around him, and at the profiles that gradually emerged from this gloom, was so like the gloom of hell. He waited for this darkness to be shattered by the light of the second coming, for the ceiling to crack upward, revealing, for every eye to see, the chariots of fire on which descended a wrathful God and all the host of heaven. He sank far down in his seat, as though his crouching might make him invisible and deny his presence there. But then he thought, not yet. The day of judgment is not yet. And voices reached him, the voices no doubt of the hapless man and the evil woman, and he raised his eyes helplessly and watched the screen. The woman was most evil. She was blonde and pasty white, and she had lived in London, which was in England, quite some time ago, judging from her clothes, and she coughed. She had a terrible disease, tuberculosis, which he had heard about. Someone in his mother's family had died of it. She had a great many boyfriends, and she smoked cigarettes and drank. When she met the young man, who was a student and who loved her very much, she was very cruel to him. She laughed at him because he was a cripple. She took his money and she went out with other men, and she lied to the student, who was certainly a fool. He limped about, looking soft and sad, and soon all John's sympathy was given to this violent and unhappy woman. He understood her when she raged and shook her lips and threw back her head in laughter so furious that it seemed the veins of her neck would burst. She walked the cold, foggy streets, a little woman and not pretty, with a lewd, brutal swagger, saying to the whole world, "You can kiss my arse." Nothing tamed or broke her. Nothing touched her. Neither kindness, nor scorn, nor hatred, nor love. She had never thought of prayer. It was unimaginable that she would ever bend her knees and come crawling along a dusty floor to anybody's altar, weeping for forgiveness. Perhaps her pride was so great that she did not need forgiveness. She had fallen from that high estate which God had intended for men and women, and she made her fall glorious because it was so complete. John could not have found in his heart, had he dared to search it, any wish for her redemption. He wanted to be like her, only more powerful, more thorough, and more cruel. To make those around him, all who hurt him, suffer as she made the students suffer, and laugh in their faces when they asked pity for their pain. He would have asked no pity, and his pain was greater than theirs. "Go on, girl," he whispered, as the student, facing her implacable ill will, sighed and wept. "Go on, girl." One day he would talk like that. He would face them and tell them how much he hated them, how they had made him suffer, how he would pay them back. Nevertheless, when she came to die, which she did eventually, looking more grotesque than ever as she deserved, his thoughts were abruptly arrested, and he was chilled by the expression on her face. She seemed to stare endlessly outward and down, in the face of a wind more piercing than any she had felt on earth, feeling herself propelled with speed into a kingdom where nothing could help her, neither her pride, nor her courage, nor her glorious wickedness. In the place where she was going, it was not these things that mattered but something else, for which she had no name, only a cold intimation, something that she could not alter in any degree, and that she had never thought of. She began to cry, her depraved face breaking into an infant's grimace, and they moved away from her, leaving her dirty in a dirty room, alone to face her maker. The scene faded out and she was gone, and though the movie went on, allowing the student to marry another girl, darker and very sweet, but by no means so arresting, John thought of this woman and her dreadful end. Again, had the thought not been blasphemous, he would have thought that it was the Lord who had led him into this theater to show him an example of the wages of sin. The movie ended and people stirred around him. The newsreel came on, and while girls in bathing suits paraded before him and boxers growled and fought, and baseball players ran home safe and presidents and kings of countries that were only names to him moved briefly across the flickering square of light, John thought of hell, of his soul's redemption, and struggled to find a compromise between the way that led to life everlasting and the way that ended in the pit. But there was none, for he had been raised in the truth. He could not claim, as African savages might be able to claim, that no one had brought him the gospel. His father and mother and all the saints had taught him from his earliest childhood what was the will of God. Either he arose from this theater, never to return, putting behind him the world and its pleasures, its honors and its glories, or he remained here with the wicked and partook of their certain punishment. Yes, it was a narrow way, and John stirred in his seat, not daring to feel it God's injustice that he must make so cruel a choice. As John approached his home again in the late afternoon, he saw little Sarah, her coat unbuttoned, come flying out of the house and run the length of the street away from him into the far drugstore. Instantly, he was frightened. He stopped a moment, staring blankly down the street, wondering what could justify such hysterical haste. It was true that Sarah was full of self-importance, and made any errand she ran seem a matter of life or death. Nevertheless, she had been sent on an errand, and with such speed that her mother had not had time to make her button up her coat. Then he felt weary. If something had really happened, it would be very unpleasant upstairs now, and he did not want to face it. But perhaps it was simply that his mother had a headache and had sent Sarah to the store for some aspirin. But if this were true, it meant that he would have to prepare supper, and take care of the children, and be naked under his father's eyes all the evening long. And he began to walk more slowly. There were some boys standing on the veranda. They watched him as he approached, and he tried not to look at them and to approximate the swagger with which they walked. One of them said, as he mounted the short, stone steps and started into the hall, "Boy, your brother was hurt real bad today." He looked at them in a kind of dread, not daring to ask for details, and he observed that they, too, looked as though they had been in a battle. Something hangdog in their looks suggested that they had been put to flight. Then he looked down and saw that there was blood at the threshold, and blood spattered on the tile floor of the vestibule. He looked again at the boys, who had not ceased to watch him, and hurried up the stairs. The door was half open, for Sarah's return, no doubt, and he walked in, making no sound, feeling a confused impulse to flee. There was no one in the kitchen, though the light was burning. The lights were on all through the house. On the kitchen table stood a shopping bag filled with groceries, and he knew that his Aunt Florence had arrived. The washtub, where his mother had been washing earlier, was open still, and filled the kitchen with a sour smell. There were drops of blood on the floor here too, and there had been small, smudged coins of blood on the stairs as he walked up. All this frightened him terribly. He stood in the middle of the kitchen, trying to imagine what had happened, and preparing himself to walk into the living room, where all the family seemed to be. Roy had been in trouble before, but this new trouble seemed to be the beginning of the fulfillment of a prophecy. He took off his coat, dropping it on a chair, and was about to start into the living room when he heard Sarah running up the steps. He waited, and she burst through the door, carrying a clumsy parcel. "What happened?" he whispered. She stared at him in astonishment and a certain wild joy. He thought again that he really did not like his sister. Catching her breath, she blurted out, triumphantly, "Roy got stabbed with a knife," and rushed into the living room. Roy got stabbed with a knife. Whatever this meant, it was sure that his father would be at his worst tonight. John walked slowly into the living room. His father and mother, a small basin of water between them, knelt by the sofa where Roy lay, and his father was washing the blood from Roy's forehead. It seemed that his mother, whose touch was so much more gentle, had been thrust aside by his father, who could not bear to have anyone else touch his wounded son. And now she watched, one hand in the water, and the other in a kind of anguish at her waist, which was circled still by the improvised apron of the morning. Her face, as she watched, was full of pain and fear, of tension barely supported, and of pity that could scarcely have been expressed had she filled all the world with her weeping. His father muttered sweet, delirious things to Roy, and his hands, when he dipped them again in the basin and wrung out the cloth, were trembling. Aunt Florence, still wearing her hat and carrying her handbag, stood a little removed, looking down at them with a troubled, terrible face. Then Sarah bounded into the room before him, and his mother looked up, reached out for the package, and saw him. She said nothing, but she looked at him with a strange, quick intentness, almost as though there were a warning on her tongue which at the moment she did not dare to utter. His Aunt Florence looked up and said, "We been wondering where you was, boy. This bad brother of yours done gone out and got hisself hurt." But John understood from her tone that the fuss was, possibly, a little greater than the danger. Roy was not, after all, going to die, and his heart lifted a little. Then his father turned and looked at him. "Where you been, boy?" he shouted. "All this time. Don't you know you's needed here at home?" More than his words. His face caused John to stiffen instantly with malice and fear. His father's face was terrible in anger, but now there was more than anger in it. John saw now what he had never seen there before, except in his own vindictive fantasies. A kind of wild, weeping terror that made the face seem younger, and yet at the same time unutterably older and more cruel. And John knew, in the moment his father's eyes swept over him, that he hated John because John was not lying on the sofa where Roy lay. John could scarcely meet his father's eyes, and yet, briefly, he did, saying nothing, feeling in his heart an odd sensation of triumph, and hoping in his heart that Roy, to bring his father low, would die. His mother had unwrapped the package and was opening a bottle of peroxide. "Here," she said. "You better wash it with this now." Her voice was calm and dry. She looked at his father briefly, her face unreadable, as she handed him the bottle and the cotton. "This going to hurt?" his father said, in such a different voice, so sad and tender, turning again to the sofa. But you just be a little man and hold still. It ain't going to take long. John watched and listened. Hating him, Roy began to moan. Aunt Florence moved to the mantelpiece and put her handbag down near the metal serpent. From the room behind, John heard the baby begin to whimper. John, said his mother, go and pick her up like a good boy. Her hands, which were not trembling, were still busy. She had opened the bottle of iodine and was cutting up strips of bandage. John walked into his parents' bedroom and picked up the squalling baby, who was wet. The moment Ruth felt him lift her up, she stopped crying and stared at him with a wide-eyed, pathetic stare, as though she knew that there was trouble in the house. John laughed at her so ancient-seeming distress. He was very fond of his baby sister, and whispered in her ear as he started back to the living room. Now, you let your big brother tell you something, baby. Just as soon as you's able to stand on your feet, you run away from this house. Run far away. He did not quite know why he said this, or where he wanted her to run, but it made him feel instantly better. His father was saying, as John came back into the room, I'm sure going to be having some questions to ask you in a minute, old lady. I'm going to be wanting to know just how come you let this boy go out and get half killed. Oh no, you ain't, said Aunt Florence. You ain't going to be starting none of that mess this evening. You know right doggone well that Roy don't never ask nobody if he can do nothing. He just go right ahead and do like he pleases. Elizabeth sure can't put no ball and chain on him. She got her hands full right here in this house, and it ain't her fault if Roy got ahead just as hard as his father's. You got an awful lot to say. Look like for once you could keep from putting your mouth in my business. He said this without looking at her. It ain't my fault, she said, that you was born a fool and always done been a fool and ain't never going to change. I swear to my father you'd try the patience of Job. I done told you before, he said. He had not ceased working over the moaning Roy, and was preparing now to dab the wound with iodine. That I didn't want you coming in here and using that gutter language in front of my children. Don't you worry about my language, brother, she said with spirit. You better start worrying about your life. What these children here ain't going to do them near as much harm as what they see. What they see, his father muttered, is a poor man trying to serve the Lord. That's my life. Then I guarantee you, she said, that they going to do their best to keep it from being their life. You mark my words. He turned and looked at her, and intercepted the look that passed between the two women. John's mother, for reasons that were not at all his father's reasons, wanted Aunt Florence to keep still. He looked away ironically. John watched his mother's mouth tighten bitterly as she dropped her eyes. His father, in silence, began bandaging Roy's forehead. It's just the mercy of God, he said at last, that this boy didn't lose his eye. Look here. His mother leaned over and looked into Roy's face with a sad, sympathetic murmur. Yet, John felt, she had seen instantly the extent of the danger to Roy's eye and to his life, and was beyond that worry now. Now she was merely marking time, as it were, and preparing herself against the moment when her husband's anger would turn, full force, against her. His father now turned to John, who was standing near the French doors with Ruth in his arms. You come here, boy, he said, and see what them white folks done to your brother. John walked over to the sofa, holding himself as proudly beneath his father's furious eyes as a prince approaching the scaffold. Look here, said his father, grasping him roughly by one arm. Look at your brother. John looked down at Roy, who gazed at him with almost no expression in his dark eyes. But John knew by the weary, impatient set of Roy's young mouth that his brother was asking that none of this be held against him. It wasn't his fault or John's, Roy's eyes said, that they had such a crazy father. His father, with the air of one forcing the sinner to look down into the pit that is to be his portion, moved away slightly so that John could see Roy's wound. Roy had been gashed by a knife, luckily not very sharp, from the center of his forehead where his hair began, downward to the bone just above his left eye. The wound described a kind of crazy half-moon and ended in a violent, fuzzy tail that was the ruin of Roy's eyebrow. Time would darken the half-moon wound into Roy's dark skin, but nothing would bring together again the so violently divided eyebrow. This crazy lift, this question, would remain with him forever, and emphasize forever something mocking and sinister in Roy's face. John felt a sudden impulse to smile. But his father's eyes were on him and he fought the impulse back. Certainly the wound was now very ugly, and very red, and must, John felt, with a quickened sympathy toward Roy, who had not cried out, have been very painful. He could imagine the sensation caused when Roy staggered into the house, blinded by his blood. But just the same, he wasn't dead, he wasn't changed. He would be in the streets again the moment he was better. You see? Came now from his father. It was white folks. Some of them white folks you like so much that tried to cut your brother's throat. John thought, with immediate anger and with a curious contempt for his father's inexactness, that only a blind man, however white, could possibly have been aiming at Roy's throat. And his mother said with a calm insistence, and he was trying to cut theirs. Him and them bad boys. Yes, said Aunt Florence. I ain't heard you ask that boy nary a question about how all this happened. Look like you just determined to raise Cain anyhow and make everybody in this house suffer because something done happened to the apple of your eye. I done asked you, cried his father in a fearful exasperation, to stop running your mouth. Don't none of this concern you. This is my family and this is my house. You want me to slap you side of the head? You slap me, she said with a placidity equally fearful. And I do guarantee you won't do no more slapping in a hurry. Hush now, said his mother, rising. Ain't no need for all this. What's done is done. We ought to be on our knees, thanking the Lord it weren't no worse. Amen to that, said Aunt Florence. Tell that foolish nigger something. You can tell that foolish son of yours something, he said to his wife with venom, having decided, it seemed, to ignore his sister. Him standing there with them big buck eyes. You can tell him to take this like a warning from the Lord. This is what white folks does to niggers. I been telling you, now you see. He better take it like a warning? Shrieked Aunt Florence. He better take it? Why, Gabriel, it ain't him went halfway across the city to get in a fight with white boys. This boy in the sofa went deliberately with a whole lot of other boys, all the way to the west side, just looking for a fight. I declare, I do wonder what goes on in your head. You know right well, his mother said, looking directly at his father, that Johnny don't travel with the same class of boys as Roy goes with. You done beat Roy too many times, here, in this very room for going out with them bad boys. Roy got himself hurt this afternoon because he was out doing something he didn't have no business doing, and that's the end of it. You ought to be thanking your Redeemer he ain't dead. And for all the care you take of him, he said. He might as well be dead. Don't look like you much care whether he lives or dies. Lord have mercy, said Aunt Florence. He's my son too, his mother said with heat. I carried him in my belly for 9 months and I know him just like I know his daddy, and they's just exactly alike. Now, you ain't got no right in the world to talk to me like that. I reckon you know, he said, choked and breathing hard, all about a mother's love. I sure reckon on you telling me how a woman can sit in the house all day and let her own flesh and blood go out and get half butchered. Don't you tell me you don't know no way to stop him, because I remembered my mother, God rest her soul, and she'd have found a way. She was my mother too, said Aunt Florence. And I recollect, if you don't, you being brought home many a time more dead than alive. She didn't find no way to stop you. She wore herself out beating on you, just like you been wearing yourself out beating on this boy here. My, he said. You got a lot to say. I ain't doing a thing, she said, but trying to talk some sense into your big, black, hard head. You better stop trying to blame everything on Elizabeth and look to your own wrongdoings. Never mind, Florence, his mother said. It's all over and done with now. I'm out of this house, he shouted. Every day the Lord sends, working to put the food in these children's mouths. Don't you think I got a right to ask the mother of these children to look after them and see that they don't break their necks before I get back home? You ain't got but one child, she said. That's liable to go out and break his neck, and that's Roy, and you know it. And I don't know how in the world you expect me to run this house and look after these children and keep running around the block after Roy. No, I can't stop him, I done told you that, and you can't stop him neither. You don't know what to do with this boy, and that's why you all the time trying to fix the blame on somebody. Ain't nobody to blame, Gabriel. You just better pray God to stop him before somebody puts another knife in him and put him in his grave. They stared at each other a moment in an awful pause, she with a startled, pleading question in her eyes. Then, with all his might, He reached out and slapped her across the face. She crumpled at once, hiding her face with one thing hand, and Aunt Florence moved to hold her up. Sarah watched all this with greedy eyes. Then Roy sat up and said in shaking voice, "Don't you slap my mother. That's my mother. You slap her again, you black bastard, and I swear to God I'll kill you." In the moment that these words filled the room, Ad hung in the room like the infinitesimal moment of hanging, jagged light that precedes an explosion. John and his father were staring into each other's eyes. John thought for that moment that his father believed the words had come from him. His eyes were so wild and depthlessly malevolent, and his mouth was twisted into such snarl of pain. Then, in the absolute silence that followed Roy's words, John saw that his father was not seeing him, was not seeing anything unless it were a vision. John wanted to turn and flee, as though he had encountered in the jungle some evil beast, crouching and ravenous, with eyes like hell unclosed. And exactly as though on a road's turning, he found himself staring at certain destruction. He found that he could not move. Then his father turned and looked down at Roy. "What did you say?" his father asked. "I told you," said Roy, "not to touch my mother." "You cursed me," said his father. Roy said nothing. Neither did he drop his eyes. "Gabriel," said his mother, "Gabriel, let us pray." His father's hands were at his waist, and he took off his belt. Tears were in his eyes. "Gabriel," cried Aunt Florence, "ain't you done playing the fool for tonight?" Then his father raised his belt, and it fell with a whistling sound on Roy, who shivered and fell back, his face to the wall. But he did not cry out, and the belt was raised again and again. The air rang with the whistling and the crack against Roy's flesh, and the baby Ruth began to scream. My lord," his father whispered. My lord," He raised the belt again, but Aunt Florence caught it from behind and held it. His mother rushed over to the sofa and caught Roy in her arms, crying as John had never seen a woman, or anybody, cry before. Roy caught his mother around the neck and held on to her as though he were drowning. Aunt Florence and his father faced each other. "Yes, Lord," Aunt Florence said. "You was born wild and you's going to die wild, but ain't no use to try to take the whole world with you. You can't change nothing, Gabriel. You ought to know that by now." John opened the church door with his father's key at 6 o'clock. Tari service officially began at 8, but it could begin at any time, whenever the Lord moved one of the saints to enter the church and pray. It was seldom, however, that anyone arrived before 8:30, the Spirit of the Lord being sufficiently tolerant to allow the saints time to do their Saturday night shopping, clean their houses, and put their children to bed. John closed the door behind him and stood in the narrow church aisle, hearing behind him the voices of children playing, and ruder voices, the voices of their elders, cursing and crying in the streets. It was dark in the church. Street lights had been snapping on all around him on the populous avenue. The light of the day was gone. His feet seemed planted on this wooden floor. They did not wish to carry him one step further. The darkness and silence of the church pressed on him, cold as judgment, and the voices crying from the window might have been crying from another world. John moved forward, hearing his feet crack against the sagging wood, to where the golden cross on the red field of the altar cloth glowed like smothered fire, and switched on one weak light. In the air of the church hung, perpetually, the odor of dust and sweat. For, like the carpet in his mother's living room, the dust of this church was invincible. And when the saints were praying or rejoicing, their bodies gave off an acrid, steamy smell, a marriage of the odors of dripping bodies and soaking, starched white linen. It was a storefront church and had stood, for John's lifetime, on the corner of this sinful avenue, facing the hospital to which criminal wounded and dying were carried almost every night. The saints, arriving, had rented this abandoned store and taken out the fixtures, had painted the walls and built a pulpit, moved in a piano and camp chairs, and bought the biggest Bible they could find. They put white curtains in the show window, and painted across this window temple of the fire baptized. Then they were ready to do the Lord's work. And the Lord, as he had promised to the 2 or 3 first gathered together, sent others. And these brought others and created a church. From this parent branch, if the Lord blessed, other branches might grow and a mighty work be begun throughout the city and throughout the land. In the history of the temple, the Lord has raised up evangelists and teachers and prophets, and called them out into the field to do his work. to do up and down the land carrying the gospel or to raise other temples in Philadelphia, Georgia, Boston, or Brooklyn. Wherever the Lord led, they followed. Every now and again one of them came home to testify of the wonders the Lord had worked through him, or her. And sometimes on a special Sunday they all visited one of the nearest churches of the Brotherhood. There had been a time before John was born when his father had also been in the field. But now, having to earn for his family their daily bread, it was seldom that he was able to travel further away than Philadelphia, and then only for a very short time. His father no longer, as he had once done, led great revival meetings, his name printed large on placards that advertised the coming of a man of God. His father had once had a mighty reputation. But all this, it seemed, had changed since he had left the South. Perhaps he ought now to have a church of his own. John wondered if his father wanted that. He ought, perhaps, to be leading, as Father James now led, a great flock to the kingdom. But his father was only a caretaker in the house of God. He was responsible for the replacement of burnt-out light bulbs, and for the cleanliness of the church and the care of the Bibles and the hymn books and the placards on the walls. On Friday night he conducted the young ministers' service and preached with them. Rarely did he bring the message on a Sunday morning. Only if there was no one else to speak was his father called upon. He was a kind of fill-in speaker, a holy handyman. Yet he was treated, so far as John could see, with great respect. No one, none of the saints in any case, had ever reproached or rebuked his father, or suggested that his life was anything but spotless. Nevertheless, this man, God's minister, had struck John's mother, and John had wanted to kill him, and wanted to kill him still. John has swept one side of the church, and the chairs were still piled in the space before the altar when there was a knocking at the door. When he opened the door he saw that it was Alicia, come to help him. "Praise the Lord," said Alicia, standing on the doorstep, grinning. "Praise the Lord," said John. This was the greeting always used among the saints. Father Alicia came in, slamming the door behind him and stamping his feet. He had probably just come from a basketball court. His forehead was polished with recent sweat and his hair stood up. He was wearing his green woolen sweater, on which was stamped the letter of his high school, and his shirt was open at the throat. "You ain't cold like that?" John asked, staring at him. "No, little brother, I ain't cold. You reckon everybody's frail like you?" "It ain't only the little ones gets carried to the graveyard," John said. He felt unaccustomedly bold and light-hearted. The arrival of Alicia had caused his mood to change. Alicia, who had started down the aisle towards the back room, turned to stare at John with astonishment and menace. "Ah," he said, "I see you fixing to be sassy with Brother Alicia tonight. I'm gonna have to give you a little correction. You just wait till I wash my hands. Ain't no need to wash your hands if you come here to work. Just take hold of that mop and put some soap and water in the bucket." "Lord," said Alicia, running water into the sink, and talking, it seemed, to the water. "That sure is a sassy nigger out there. I sure hope he don't get hisself hurt one of these days. Running his mouth that-a-way. Look like he just won't stop till somebody busts him in the eye." He sighed deeply, and began to lather his hands. "Here I come running all the way so he wouldn't bust a gut lifting one of them chairs, and all he got to say is, 'Put some water in the bucket. Can't do nothing with a nigger nohow.'" He stopped and turned to face John. "Auntie, you got no manners, boy. You better learn how to talk to old folks. You better get out here with the mop and pail. We ain't got all night." "Keep on," said Alicia. "I see I'm going to have to give you your lumps tonight." He disappeared. John heard him in the toilet, and then over the thunderous water, he heard him knocking things over in the back room. "Now what you doing? Boy, leave me alone. I'm fixing to work." "It sure sounds like it." John dropped his broom and walked into the back. Alicia had knocked over a pile of camp chairs, folded in the corner, and stood over them angrily, holding the mop in his hand. "I keep telling you not to hide that mop back there. Can't nobody get at it? I always get at it. Ain't everybody as clumsy as you?" Alicia let fall the stiff gray mop and rushed at John, catching him off balance and lifting him from the floor. With both arms tightening around John's waist, he tried to cut John's breath, watching him meanwhile with a smile that, as John struggled and squirmed, became a set, ferocious grimace. With both hands John pushed and pounded against the shoulders and biceps of Alicia, and tried to thrust with his knees against Elisha's belly. Usually such a battle was soon over, since Elisha was so much bigger and stronger and as a wrestler so much more skilled. But tonight John was filled with a determination not to be conquered, or at least to make the conquest dear. With all the strength that was in him he fought against Elisha, and he was filled with a strength that was almost hatred. He kicked, pounded, twisted, pushed, using his lack of size to confound and exasperate Elisha, whose damp fists, joined at the small of John's back, soon slipped. It was a deadlock. He could not tighten his hold, John could not break it. And so they turned, battling in the narrow room, and the odor of Elisha's sweat was heavy in John's nostrils. He saw the veins rise on Elisha's forehead and in his neck. His breath became jagged and harsh, and the grimace on his face became more cruel. And John, watching these manifestations of his power, was filled with a wild delight. They stumbled against the folding chairs, and Elisha's foot slipped and his hold broke. They stared at each other, half grinning. John slumped to the floor, holding his head between his hands. "I didn't hurt you none, did I?" Elisha asked. John looked up. "Me? No, I just want to catch my breath." Elisha went to the sink and splashed cold water on his face and neck. "I reckon you going to let me work now," he said. "It wasn't me that stopped you in the first place." He stood up. He found that his legs were trembling. He looked at Elisha, who was drying himself on the towel. "You teach me wrestling one time, okay?" "No, boy," Elisha said, laughing. "I don't want to wrestle with you. You're too strong for me." And he began to run hot water into the great pail. John walked past him to the front and picked up his broom. In a moment Elisha followed and began mopping near the door. John had finished sweeping, and he now mounted to the pulpit to dust the 3 throne-like chairs, purple, with white linen squares for the headpieces and for the massive arms. It dominated all, the pulpit. A wooden platform raised above the congregation, with a high stand in the center for the Bible, before which the preacher stood. There faced the congregation, flowing downwards from this height, the scarlet altar cloth that bore the golden cross and the legend, "Jesus saves." The pulpit was holy. None could stand so high unless God's seal was on him. He dusted the piano and sat down on the piano stool to wait until Elisha had finished mopping on side of the church and he could replace the chairs. Suddenly Elisha said, without looking at him, "Boy, ain't it time you was thinking about your soul?" "I guess so," John said with a quietness that terrified him. "I know it looks hard," said Elisha. "From the outside, especially when you young. But you believe me, boy, you can't find no greater joy than you find in the service of the Lord." John said nothing. He touched a black key on the piano and it made a dull sound, like a distant drum. "You got to remember," Elisha said, turning now to look at him, "that you think about it with a carnal mind. You still got Adam's mind, boy, and you keep thinking about your friend, you want to do what they do, and you want to go to the movies, and I bet you think about girls, don't you, Johnny?" "Sure you do," he said, half smiling, finding his answer in John's face. "And you don't want to give up all that. But when the Lord saves you, he burns out all that old Adam. He gives you a new mind and a new heart, and then you don't find no pleasure in the world. You get all your joy in walking and talking with Jesus every day." He stared in a dull paralysis of terror at the body of Elisha. He saw him standing. Had Elisha forgotten? Beside Ella May before the altar while Father James rebuked him for the evil that lived in the flesh. He looked into Elisha's face, full of questions he would never ask. And Elisha's face told him nothing. "People say it's hard," said Elisha, bending again to his mop. "But, let me tell you, it ain't as hard as living in this wicked world and all the sadness of the world where there ain't no pleasure nohow, and then dying and going to hell. Ain't nothing as hard as that." And he looked back at John. "You see how the devil tricks people into losing their soul?" "Yes," said John at last, sounding almost angry, unable to bear his thoughts, unable to bear the silence in which Elisha looked at him. Elisha grinned. "They got girls in the school I go to." He was finished with one side of the church and he motioned to John to replace the chairs. "And they nice girls, but their minds ain't on the Lord, and I try to tell them the time to repent ain't tomorrow, it's today. They think ain't no sense to worrying now. They can sneak into heaven on their deathbed. But I tell them, honey, ain't everybody lies down to die. People going all the time just like that. Today you see them and tomorrow you don't. Boy, they don't know what to make of old Elisha because he don't go to movies, and he don't dance, and he don't play cards, and he don't go with them behind the stairs. He paused and stared at John, who watched him helplessly, not knowing what to say. And boy, some of them is real nice girls, I mean beautiful girls, and when you got so much power that they don't tempt you, then you know you saved sure enough. I just look at them and I tell them Jesus saved me one day, and I'm gonna go all the way with him. Ain't no woman, no, nor no man neither going to make me change my mind. He paused again, and smiled and dropped his eyes. That Sunday, he said. That Sunday, you remember? When Father got up in the pulpit and called me an LMA down because he thought we was about to commit sin. Well boy, I don't want to tell no lie, I was mighty hot against the old man that Sunday. But I thought about it, and the Lord made me to see that he was right. Me and LMA, we didn't have nothing on our minds at all, but look like the devil is just everywhere. Sometime the devil he put his hand on you and look like you just can't breathe. Look like you just burning up and you got to do something and you can't do nothing. I've been on my knees many a time, weeping and wrestling before the Lord, crying Johnny and calling on Jesus' name. That's the only name that's got power over Satan. That's the way it's been with me sometime, and I'm saved. What you think it's going to be like for you, boy? He looked at John, who, head down, was putting the chairs in order. Do you want to be saved, Johnny? I don't know, John said. Will you try him? Just fall on your knees one day and ask him to help you to pray. John turned away and looked out over the church, which now seemed like a vast, high field, ready for the harvest. He thought of a first Sunday, a communion Sunday not long ago when the saints, dressed all in white, ate flat, unsalted Jewish bread, which was the body of the Lord, and drank red grape juice, which was his blood. And when they rose from the table, prepared especially for this day, they separated, the men on the one side, and the women on the other, and 2 basins were filled with water so that they could wash each other's feet, as Christ had commanded his disciples to do. They knelt before each other, woman before woman, and man before man, and washed and dried each other's feet. Brother Elisha had knelt before John's father. When the service was over, they had kissed each other with a holy kiss. John turned again and looked at Elisha. Elisha looked at him and smiled. You think about what I say, boy. When they were finished, Elisha sat down at the piano and played to himself. John sat on a chair in the front row and watched him. Don't look like nobody's coming tonight, he said after a long while. Elisha did not arrest his playing of a mournful song. Oh Lord, have mercy on me. They'll be here, said Elisha. And as he spoke, there was a knocking on the door. Elisha stopped playing. John went to the door, where 2 sisters stood, Sister McCandless and Sister Price. Praise the Lord, son, they said. Praise the Lord, said John. They entered, heads bowed and hands folded before them around their Bibles. They bore the black cloth coats that they wore all week, and they had old felt hats on their heads. John felt a chill as they passed him, and he closed the door. Elisha stood up, and they cried again, Praise the Lord! Then the 2 women knelt for a moment before their seats to pray. This was also passionate ritual. Each entering saint, before he could take part in the service, must commune for a moment alone with the Lord. John watched the praying women. Elisha sat again at the piano and picked up his mournful song. The women rose, Sister Price first, and then Sister McCandless, and looked around the church. Is we the first? Asked Sister Price. Her voice was mild. Her skin was copper. She was younger than Sister McCandless by several years, a single woman who had never, as she testified, known a man. No, Sister Price, smiled Brother Elisha. Brother Johnny here was the first. Him and me cleaned up this evening. Brother Johnny is mighty faithful, said Sister McCandless. The Lord's going to work with him in a mighty way, you mark my words. There were times whenever, in fact, the Lord had shown his favor by working through her, when whatever Sister McCandless said sounded like a threat. Tonight she was still very much under the influence of the sermon she had preached the night before. She was an enormous woman, one of the biggest and blackest God had ever made, and he had blessed her with a mighty voice with which to sing and preach, and she was going out soon into the field. For many years the Lord had pressed Sister McCandless to get up, as she said, and move, but she had been of timid disposition and feared to set herself above the others. Not until he laid her low, before this very altar, had she dared to rise and preach the gospel. But now she had buckled on her traveling shoes. She would cry aloud and spare not, and lift up her voice like a trumpet in Zion. Yes, said Sister Price with her gentle smile. He says that he that is faithful in little things shall be made chief over many. John smiled back at her, a smile that, despite the shy gratitude it was meant to convey, did not escape being ironic or even malicious. But Sister Price did not see this, which deepened John's hidden scorn. Ain't but you two who clean the church? Asked Sister McCandless with an unnerving smile, the smile of the prophet who sees the secrets hidden in the hearts of men. Lord, Sister McCandless, said Alicia. Look like it ain't never but us two. I don't know what the other young folks does on Saturday nights, but they don't come nowhere near here. Neither did Alicia usually come anywhere near the church on Saturday evenings. But as the pastor's nephew he was entitled to certain freedoms. In him it was a virtue that he came at all. It sure is time we had a revival among our young folks, said Sister McCandless. They cooling off something terrible. The Lord ain't going to bless no church what lets its young people get so lax. No, sir, he said, because you ain't neither hot or cold I'm going to spit you out in my mouth. That's the word. And she looked around sternly, and Sister Price nodded. And Brother Johnny here ain't even saved yet, said Alicia. Look like the saved young people would be ashamed to let him be more faithful in the house of God than they are. He said that the first shall be last and the last shall be first, said Sister Price with a triumphant smile. Indeed he did, agreed Sister McCandless. This boy going to make it to the kingdom before any of them, you wait and see. Amen, said Brother Alicia, and he smiled at John. Is Father going to come and be with us tonight? Asked Sister McCandless after a moment. Alicia frowned and thrust out his lower lip. I don't reckon so, sister, he said. I believe he going to try to stay home tonight and preserve his strength for the morning service. The Lord's been speaking to him in visions and dreams, and he ain't got much sleep lately. Yes, said Sister McCandless. That sure is a praying man. I tell you, it ain't every shepherd tarries before the Lord for his flock like Father James does. Indeed, that is the truth, said Sister Price with animation. The Lord sure done blessed us with a good shepherd. He mighty hard sometimes, said Sister McCandless. But the word is hard. The way of holiness ain't no joke. He done made me to know that, said Brother Alicia with a smile. Sister McCandless stared at him. Then she laughed. Lord, she cried. I bet you can say so. And I loved him for that, said Sister Price. It ain't every pastor going to set down his own nephew, in front of the whole church, too. And Alicia hadn't committed no big fault. Ain't no such thing, said Sister McCandless, as a little fault or a big fault. Satan gets his foot in the door, he ain't gonna rest till he's in the room. You is in the word or you ain't. Ain't no halfway with God. You reckon we ought to start? Asked Sister Price doubtfully after a pause. Don't look to me like nobody else is coming. Now, don't you sit there, laughed Sister McCandless, and be of little faith like that. I just believe the Lord's going to give us a great service tonight. She turned to John. Ain't your daddy coming out tonight? Yes'm, John replied. He said he was coming. There, said Sister McCandless. And you, Mama, is she coming out too? I don't know, John said. She mighty tired. She ain't so tired she can't come out and pray a little while, said Sister McCandless. For a moment John hated her, and he stared at her fat, black profile in anger. Sister Price said, But I declare, it's a wonder how that woman works like she does, and keeps those children looking so neat and clean and all, and gets out to the house of God almost every night. Can't be nothing but the Lord that bears her up. I reckon we might have a little song, said Sister McCandless, just to warm things up. I sure hate to walk in a church where folks is just sitting and talking. Look like it takes all my spirit away. Amen, said Sister Price. Alicia began a song. This may be my last time. And they began to sing. This may be the last time I pray with you. This may be my last time, I don't know. As they sang, they clapped their hands, and John saw Sister McCandless looked about her for a tambourine. He rose and mounted the pulpit steps, and took from the small opening at the bottom of the pulpit 3 tambourines. He gave one to Sister McCandless, who nodded and smiled, not breaking her rhythm, and he put the rest on a chair near Sister Price. This may be the last time I sing with you, This may be my last time, I don't know. He watched them, singing with them, because otherwise they would force him to sing, and trying not to hear the words that he forced outwards from his throat. And he thought to clap his hands, but he could not. They remained tightly folded in his lap. If he did not sing, they would be upon him, but his heart told him that he had no right to sing or to rejoice. Oh, this may be my last time, this may be my last time, oh, this may be my last time. And he watched Elisha, who was a young man in the Lord, who, a priest after the order of Melchizedek, had been given power over death and hell. The Lord had lifted him up, and turned him around, and set his feet on the shining way. What were the thought of Elisha when night came, and he was alone where no eye could see, and no tongue bear witness, save only the trumpet-like tongue of God? Were his thought, his bed, his body foul? What were his dreams? This may be my last time, I don't know. Behind him the door opened and the wintry air rushed in. He turned to see, entering the door, his father, his mother, and his aunt. It was only the presence of his aunt that shocked him, for she had never entered this church before. She seemed to have been summoned to witness a bloody act. It was in all her aspect, quiet with a dreadful quietness, as she moved down the aisle behind his mother and knelt for a moment beside his mother and father to pray. John knew that it was the hand of the Lord that had led her to this place, and his heart grew cold. The Lord was riding on the wind tonight. What might that wind have spoken before the morning came? Part 2. The Prayer of the Saints. And they cried with a loud voice, saying, How long, O Lord, holy and true, dost thou not judge and avenge our blood on them that dwell on the earth? 1 Florence's Prayer. Light and life to all he brings, risen with healing in his wings. Florence raised her voice in the only song she could remember that her mother used to sing. It's me, it's me, it's me, O Lord, standing in the need of prayer. Gabriel turned to stare at her, in astonished triumph that his sister should at last be humbled. She did not look at him. Her thoughts were all on God. After a moment, the congregation and the piano joined her. Not my father, not my mother, but it's me, O Lord. She knew that Gabriel rejoiced, not that her humility might lead her to grace, but only that some private anguish had brought her low. Her songs revealed that she was suffering, and this her brother was glad to see. This had always been his spirit. Nothing had ever changed it. Nothing ever would. For a moment her pride stood up. The resolution that had brought her to this place tonight faltered, and she felt that if Gabriel was the Lord's anointed, she would rather die and endure hell for all eternity than bow before his altar. But she strangled her pride, rising to stand with them in the holy space before the altar, and still singing, standing in the need of prayer, kneeling as she had not knelt for many years, and in this company before the altar, she gained again from the song the meaning it had held for her mother, and gained a new meaning for herself. As a child, the song had made her see a woman, dressed in black, standing in infinite mists alone, waiting for the form of the Son of God to lead her through the white fire. This woman now returned to her more desolate. It was herself not knowing where to put her foot. She waited trembling, for the mists to be parted that she might walk in peace. That long road, her life, which she had followed for 60 groaning years, had led her at last to her mother's starting place, the altar of the Lord. For her feet stood on the edge of that river which her mother, rejoicing, had crossed over. And would the Lord now reach out his hand to Florence and heal and save? But, going down before the scarlet cloth at the foot of the golden cross, it came to her that she had forgotten how to pray. Her mother has taught her that the way to pray was to forget everything and everyone but Jesus. To pour out of the heart, like water from a bucket, all evil thoughts, all thoughts of self, all malice for one's enemies. To come boldly, and yet more humbly than the little child, before the giver of all good things. Yet, in Florence's heart tonight hatred and bitterness weighed like granite. Pride refused to abdicate from the throne it had held so long. Neither love nor humility had led her to the altar, but only fear. And God did not hear the prayers of the fearful, for the hearts of the fearful held no belief. Such prayers could rise no higher than the lips that uttered them. Around her she heard the saints' voices, a steady, charged murmur, with now and again the name of Jesus rising above, sometimes like the swift rising of a bird into the air of a sunny day, sometimes like the slow rising of the mist from swamp ground. Was this the way to pray? In the church that she had joined when she first came north, one knelt before the altar once only, in the beginning, to ask for forgiveness of sins. And this accomplished, one was baptized and became a Christian, to kneel no more thereafter. Even if the Lord should lay some great burden on one's back, as he has done, but never so heavy a burden as this she carried now, one prayed in silence. It was indecent, the practice of common niggers, to cry aloud at the foot of the altar, tears streaming for all the world to see. She had never done it, not even as a girl down home in the church they had gone to in those days. Now perhaps it was too late, and the Lord would suffer her to die in the darkness in which she had lived so long. In the olden days God had healed his children. He had caused the blind to see, the lame to walk, and he had raised dead men from the grave. But Florence remembered one phrase, which now she muttered against the knuckles that bruised her lips. Lord, help my unbelief. For the message had come to Florence that had come to Hezekiah. Set thine house in order, for thou shalt die and not live. Many nights ago, as she turned on her bed, this message came to her. For many days and nights the message was repeated. There had been time then to turn to God, but she had thought to evade him, seeking among the women she knew for remedies. And then, because the pain increased, she had sought doctors. And when the doctors did no good, she had climbed stairs all over town to rooms where incense burned and where men or women in traffic with the devil gave her white powders, or herbs to make tea, and cast spells upon her to take the sickness away. The burning in her bowels did not cease, that burning which, eating inward, took the flesh visibly from her bones and caused her to vomit up her food. Then one night she found Death standing in the room, blacker than night and gigantic. He filled one corner of her narrow room, watching her with eyes like the eyes of a serpent when his head is lifted to strike. Then she screamed and called on God, turning on the light. And Death departed, but she knew he would be back. Every night would bring him a little closer to her bed. And after Death's first silent vigil, her life came to her bedside to curse her with many voices. Her mother, in rotting rags filling the room with the stink of the grave, stood over her to curse the daughter who had denied her on her deathbed. Gabriel came, from all his times and ages, to curse the sister who had held him to scorn and mocked his ministry. Deborah, black, her body as shapeless and hard as iron, looked on with veiled, triumphant eyes, cursing the Florence who had mocked her in her pain and barrenness. Frank came, even he, with that same smile, the same tilt of his head. Of them all she would have begged forgiveness, had they come with ears to hear. But they came like many trumpets. Even if they had come to hear and not to testify, it was not they who could forgive her, but only God. The piano had stopped. All around her now were only the voices of the saints. Dear Father, it was her mother praying. We come before you on our knees this evening to ask you to watch over us and hold back the hand of the destroying angel. Lord, sprinkle the doorpost of this house with the blood of the Lamb to keep all the wicked men away. Lord, we, praying for every mother's son and daughter everywhere in the world, but we want you to take special care of this girl here tonight. Lord, and don't let no evil come nigh her. We know you's able to do it. Lord, in Jesus' name, amen. This was the first prayer Florence heard, the only prayer she was ever to hear in which her mother demanded the protection of God more passionately for her daughter than she demanded it for her son. It was night, the windows were shut tightly with the shades drawn, and the great table was pushed against the door. The kerosene lamps burned low and made great shadows on the newspaper-covered wall. Her mother, dressed in the long, shapeless, colorless dress that she bore every day but Sunday, when she wore white, and with her head tied up in a scarlet cloth, knelt in the center of the room, her hands hanging loosely folded before her, her black face lifted, her eyes shut. The weak, unsteady light placed shadows under her mouth and in the sockets of her eyes, making the face impersonal with majesty, like the face of a prophetess, or like a mask. Silence filled the room after her amen. And in the silence they heard, far up the road, the sound of a horse's hoofs. No one moved. Gabriel, from his corner near the stove, looked up and watched his mother. I ain't afraid, said Gabriel. His mother turned, one hand raised. You hush now. Trouble had taken place in town today. Their neighbor Deborah, who was 16, 3 years older than Florence, had been taken away into the fields the night before by many white men, where they did things to her to make her cry and bleed. Today, Deborah's father had gone to one of the white men's house, and said that he would kill him and all the other white men he could find. They had beaten him and left him for dead. Now everyone had shut their doors, praying and waiting. For it was said that the white folks would come tonight and set fire to all the houses, as they had done before. In the night that pressed outside they heard only the horses' hoofs, which did not stop. There was not the laughter they would have heard had there been many coming on this road, and no calling out of curses, and no one crying for mercy to white men or to God. The hoofbeats came to the door and passed, and rang, while they listened, ever more faintly away. Then Florence realized how frightened she had been. She watched her mother rise and walk to the window. She peered out through a corner of the blanket that covered it. "They's gone," she said, "whoever they was." Then, "Blessed be the name of the Lord," she said. Thus had her mother lived and died, and she had often been brought low, but she had never been forsaken. She had always seemed to Florence the oldest woman in the world, for she often spoke of Florence and Gabriel as the children of her old age, and she had been born innumerable years ago during slavery on a plantation in another state. On this plantation she had grown up as one of the field workers, for she was very tall and strong, and by she had married and raised children, all of whom had been taken from her, one by sickness and two by auction, and one, whom she had not been allowed to call her own, had been raised in the master's house. When she was a woman grown, well past 30 as she reckoned it, with one husband buried, but the master had given her another, armies, plundering and burning, had come from the north to set them free. This was in answer to the prayers of the faithful, who had never ceased, both day and night, to cry out for deliverance. For it had been the will of God that they should hear, and pass thereafter, one to another, the story of the Hebrew children who had been held in bondage in the land of Egypt, and how the Lord had heard their groaning, and how his heart was moved, and how he bid them wait but a little season till he should send deliverance. Florence's mother had known this story, so it seemed, from the day she was born. And while she lived, rising in the morning before the sun came up, standing and bending in the fields when the sun was high, crossing the fields homeward when the sun went down at the gates of heaven far away, hearing the whistle of the foreman and his eerie cry across the fields, in the whiteness of winter when hogs and turkeys and geese were slaughtered, and lights burned bright in the big house, and Bathsheba, the cook, sent over in a napkin bits of ham and chicken and cakes left over by the white folks, in all that befell. In her joys, her pipe in the evening, her man at night, the children she suckled, and guided on their first short steps. And in her tribulations, death and parting, and the lash, she did not forget that deliverance was promised and would surely come. She had only to endure and trust in God. She knew that the big house, the house of pride where the white folks lived, would come down. It was written in the word of God. They, who walked so proudly now, had nor fashioned for themselves or their children so sure a foundation as was hers. They walked on the edge of a steep place and their eyes were sightless. God would cause them to rush down, as the herd of swine had once rushed down into the sea. For all that they were so beautiful, and took their ease, she knew them, and she pitied them, who would have no covering in the great day of his wrath. Yet, she told her children, God was just, and he struck no people without first giving many warnings. God gave men time, but all the times were in his hand, and one day the time to forsake evil and do good would all be finished. Then only the whirlwind, death riding on the whirlwind, awaited those people who had forgotten God. In all the days that she was growing up, signs failed not, but none heeded. Slaves done ris, was whispered in the cabin and at the master's gate. Slaves in another county had fired the master's houses and fields and dashed their children to death against the stones. Another slave in hell, Bathsheba might say one morning, shooing the pickaninnies away from the great porch. A slave had killed his master, or his overseer, and had gone down to hell to pay for it. I ain't got long to stay here, someone crooned beside her in the fields, someone who would be gone by morning on his journey north. All these signs, like the plagues with which the Lord had afflicted Egypt, only hardened the hearts of these people against the Lord. They thought the lash would save them, and they used the lash, or the knife, or the gallows, or the auction block. They thought that kindness would save then, and the master and mistress came down, smiling, to the cabins, making much of the pickaninnies and bearing gifts. These were great days, and they all, black and white, seemed happy together. But when the word has gone forth from the mouth of God, nothing can turn it back. The word was fulfilled one morning, before she was awake. Many of the stories her other told meant nothing to Florence. She knew them for what they were, tales told by an old black woman in a cabin in the evening to distract her children from their cold and hunger. But the story of this day she was never to forget. It was a day for which she lived. There was a great running and shouting, said her mother everywhere outside, and, as she opened her eyes to the light of that day, so bright, she said, and cold, she was certain that the judgment trumpet had sounded. While she still sat, amazed and wondering what on the judgment day would be the best behavior, in rushed Bathsheba, and behind her many tumbling children and field hands and house niggers, all together, and Bathsheba shouted, rise up, Sister Rachel, and see the Lord's deliverance. He done brought us out of Egypt, just like he promised, and we's free at last." Bathsheba grabbed her, tears running down her face. She, dressed in the clothes in which she had slept, walked to the door to look out on the new day God had given them. On that day she saw the proud house humbled, green silk and velvet blowing out of windows, and the garden trampled by many horsemen, and the big gate open. The master and mistress and their kin, and one child she had borne were in that house, which she did not enter. Soon it occurred to her that there was no longer any reason to tarry here. She tied her things in a cloth that she put on her head, and walked out through the big gate, never to see that country any more. And this became Florence's deep ambition. To walk out one morning through the cabin door, never to return. Her father, whom she scarcely remembered, had departed that way one morning not many months after the birth of Gabriel. And not only her father. Every day she heard that another man or woman had said farewell to this iron earth and sky, and started on the journey north. But her mother had no wish to go north where, she said, wickedness dwelt and death rode mighty through the streets. She was content to stay in this cabin and do washing for the white folks, though she was old and her back was sore. And she wanted Florence also to be content, helping with the washing and fixing meals and keeping Gabriel quiet. Gabriel was the apple of his mother's eye. If he had never been born, Florence might have looked forward to a day when she would be released from her unrewarding round of labor, when she might think of her own future and go out to make it. With the birth of Gabriel, which occurred when she was 5, her future was swallowed up. There was only one future in that house, and it was Gabriel's, to which, since Gabriel was a man-child, all else must be sacrificed. Her mother did not, indeed, think of it as sacrifice but as logic. Florence was a girl and would by and by be married, and have children of her own, and all the duties of a woman. And this being so, her life in the cabin was the best possible preparation for her future life. But Gabriel was a man. He would go out one day into the world to do a man's work, and he needed, therefore, meat, when there was any in the house, and clothes, whenever clothes could be bought, and the strong indulgence of his womenfolk, so that he would know how to be with women when he had a wife. And he needed the education that Florence desired far more than he, and that she might have got if he had not been born. It was Gabriel who was slapped and scrubbed each morning and sent off to the one-room schoolhouse, which he hated, and where he managed to learn, so far as Florence could discover, almost nothing at all. And often he was not at school but getting into mischief with other boys. Almost all of their neighbors, and even some of the white folks, came at one time or another to complain of Gabriel's wrongdoing. Their mother would walk out into the yard and cut a switch from a tree and beat him. Beat him, it seemed to Florence, until any other boy would have fallen down dead, and so often that any other boy would have ceased his wickedness. Nothing stopped Gabriel, though he made heaven roar with his howling, though he screamed aloud, as his mother approached, that he would never be such a bad boy again. And, after the beating, his pants still down around his knees and his face wet with tears and mucus, Gabriel was made to kneel down while his mother prayed. She asked Florence to pray, too, but in her heart Florence never prayed. She hoped that Gabriel would break his neck. She wanted the evil against which their mother prayed to overtake him one day. In those days Florence and Deborah, who had come close friend after Deborah's accident, hated all men. When men looked at Deborah they saw no father that her unlovely and violated body. In their eyes lived perpetually a lewd, uneasy wonder concerning the night she had been taken in the fields. That night had robbed her of the right to be considered a woman. No man would approach her in honor because she was a living reproach to herself and to all black women and to all black men. If she had been beautiful, and if God had not given her a spirit so demure, she might, with ironic gusto, have acted out that rape in the field forever. Since she could not be considered a woman, she could only be looked on as a harlot, a source of delight more bestial and mysteries more shaking than any a proper woman could provide. Lust stirred in the eyes of men when they look at Deborah. Lust that could not be endured because it was so impersonal, limiting communion to the area of her shame. And Florence, who was beautiful but did not look with favor on any of the black men who lusted after her, not wishing to exchange her mother's cabin for one of theirs and to raise their children and so go down, toil-blasted into, as it were, a common grave, reinforced in Deborah the terrible belief against which evidence had ever presented itself. That all men were like this, their thoughts rose no higher, and they lived only to gratify on the bodies of women their brutal and humiliating needs. One Sunday at a camp meeting, when Gabriel was 12 years old and was to be baptized, Deborah and Florence stood on the banks of a river along with all the other folks and watched him. Gabriel had not wished to be baptized. The thought had frightened and angered him, but his mother insisted that Gabriel was now of an age to be responsible before God for his sins. She would not shirk the duty, laid on her by the Lord, of doing everything within his power to bring him to the throne of grace. On the banks of a river, under the violent light of noon, confessed believers and children of Gabriel's age waited to be led into the water. Standing out, waist-deep and robed in white, was the preacher, who would hold their heads briefly under the water, crying out to heaven as the baptized held his breath. I indeed have baptized you with water, but he shall baptize you with the Holy Ghost. Then, as they rose sputtering and blinded and were led to the shore, he cried out again, Go thou and sin no more. They came up from the water, visibly under the power of the Lord, and on the shore the saints awaited them, beating their tambourines. Standing bare the shore were the elders of the church, holding towels with which to cover the newly baptized, who were then led into the tents, one for either sex, where they could change their clothes. At last, Gabriel, dressed in an old white shirt and short linen pants, stood on the edge of the water. Then he was slowly led into the river, where he had so often splashed naked, until he reached the preacher. And the moment that the preacher threw him down, crying out the words of John the Baptist, Gabriel began to kick and sputter, nearly throwing the preacher off balance. And though at first they thought that it was the power of the Lord that worked in him, they realized as he rose, still kicking and with his eyes tightly shut, that it was only fury and too much water in his nose. Some folks smiled, but Florence and Deborah did not smile. Though Florence had also been indignant, years before when the slimy water entered her incautiously open mouth. She had done her best not to sputter, and she had not cried out. But now, here came Gabriel, floundering and furious up the bank, and what she looked at, with an anger more violent than any she had felt before, was his nakedness. He was drenched, and his thin, white clothes clung like another skin to his black body. Florence and Deborah looked at one another, while the singing rose to cover Gabriel's howling, and Deborah looked away. Years later, Deborah and Florence had stood on Deborah's porch at night and watched a vomit-covered Gabriel stagger up the moonlight road, and Florence had cried out, I hate him! I hate him! Big, black, prancing tomcat of a nigger. And Deborah had said, in that heavy voice of hers, You know, honey, the word tell us to hate the sin but not the sinner. In 1900, when she was 26, Florence walked out through the cabin door. She had thought to wait until her mother, who was so ill now that she no longer stirred out of bed, should be buried. But suddenly she knew that she would wait no longer. The time had come. She had been working as cook and serving girl for a large white family in town, and it was on the day her master proposed that she become his concubine that she knew her life among these wretched people had come to its destined end. She left her employment that same day, leaving behind her a most vehement conjugal bitterness, and with part of the money that with cunning, cruelty, and sacrifice she had saved over a period of years, bought a railroad ticket to New York. When she bowed it, in a kind of scarlet rage, she held like a talisman at the back of her mind the thought, I can give it back, I can sell it. This don't mean I got to go. But she knew that nothing could stop her. And it was this leave-taking that came to stand, in Florence's latter days, and with other many witness at her bedside. Gray clouds obscured the sun that day, and outside the cabin window she saw that mist still covered the ground. Her mother lay in bed, awake. She was pleading with Gabriel, who had been out drinking the night before, and who was not really sober now, to mend his ways and come to the Lord. And Gabriel, full of the confusion and pain and guilt that were his whenever he thought of how he made his mother suffer, but that became nearly insupportable when she taxed him with it, stood before the mirror, head bowed, buttoning his shirt. Florence knew that he could not unlock his lips to speak. He could not say yes to his mother and to the Lord, and he could not say no. "Honey," their mother was saying, "don't you let your old mother die without you look her in the eye and tell her she going to see you in glory. You hear me, boy?" In a moment, Florence thought with scorn, tears would fill his eyes, and he would promise to do better. He had been promising to do better since the day he had been baptized. She put down her bag in the center of the hateful room. "Ma," she said, I'm a-going this morning." Now that she had said it, she was angry with herself for not having said it the night before, so that they would have had time to be finished with their weeping and their arguments. She had not trusted herself to withstand the night before, but now there was almost no time tea. The center of her mind was filled with the image of the great, white clock at the railway station, on which the hands did not cease to move. "You going where?" her mother asked sharply. But she knew that her mother had understood, had indeed long before this moment known that this time would come. The astonishment with which she stared at Florence's bag was not altogether astonishment, but a startled, wary attention. A danger imagined had become present and real, and her mother was already searching for a way to break Florence's will. All this Florence knew in a moment, and it made her stronger. She watched her mother, waiting. But at the tone of his mother's voice, Gabriel, who had scarcely heard Florence's announcement, so grateful had he been that something had occurred to distract from him his mother's attention, dropped his eyes and saw Florence's traveling bag. And he repeated his mother's question in a stunned, angry voice, understanding it only as the words hit the air. "Yes, girl. Where you think you going?" "I'm going," she said, "to New York. I got my ticket." And her mother watched her. For a moment no one said a word. Then Gabriel, in a changed and frightened voice, asked, "And when you done decide that?" She did not look at him, nor answer his question. She continued to watch her mother. "I got my ticket," she repeated. "I'm going on the morning train." "Girl," asked her mother, quietly, "is you sure you know what you's doing?" She stiffened, seeing in her mother's eyes a mocking pity. "I'm a woman grown," she said. "I know what I'm doing." "And you going," cried Gabriel, "this morning, just like that? And you gonna walk off and leave your mother, just like that?" "You hush," she said, turning to him for the first time. "She got you, ain't she?" This was indeed, she realized as he dropped his eyes, the bitter, troubling point. He could not endure the thought of being left alone with his mother, with nothing whatever to put between himself and his guilty love. With Florence gone, time would have swallowed up all his mother's children, except himself. And he, then, must make amends for all the pain that she had borne, and sweeten her last moments with all his proofs of love. And his mother required of him one proof only, that he tarry no longer in sin. With Florence gone, his stammering time, his playing time, contracted with a bound to the sparest interrogative second, when he must stiffen himself, and answer to his mother, and all the host of heaven, yes or no. Florence smiled inwardly, a small, malicious smile, watching his slow bafflement and panic and rage, and she looked at her mother again. "She got you," she repeated. "She don't need me. You going north," her mother said then. "And when you reckon on coming back?" "I don't reckon on coming back," she said. "You come crying back soon enough," said Gabriel with malevolence. "Soon as they whip your butt up there 4 or 5 times." She looked at him again. "Just don't you try to hold your breath till then. You hear?" "Girl," said her mother. "You mean to tell me the devil's done made your heart so hard you can just leave your mother on her dying bed, and you don't care if you don't never see her in this world no more? Honey, you can't tell me you done got so evil as all that." She felt Gabriel watching her to see how she would take this question. The question that, for all her determination, she had dreaded most to hear. She looked away from her mother, and straightened, catching her breath, looking outwards through the small, cracked window. There outside, beyond the slowly rising mist, and farther off that her eyes could see, her life awaited her. The woman on the bed was old. Her life was fading as the mist rose. She thought of her mother as already in the grave, and she would not let herself be strangled by the hands of the dead. "I'm going, Ma," she said. "I got to go." Her mother leaned back, face upward to the light, and began to cry. Gabriel moved to Florence's side and grabbed her arm. She looked up into his face and saw that his eyes were full of tears. "You can't go," he said. "You can't go. You can't go and leave your mother this away. She need a woman, Florence, to help look after her. What's she going to do here all alone with me?" She pushed him from her and moved to stand over her mother's bed. "Ma," she said, "don't be like that. Ain't a thing can happen to me up north can't happen to me here. God's everywhere, Ma. Ain't no need to worry." She knew that she was mouthing words, and she realized suddenly that her mother scorned to dignify these words with her attention. She had granted Florence the victory, with a promptness that had the effect of making Florence, however dimly and unwillingly, wonder if her victory was real. She was not weeping for her daughter's future. She was weeping for the past, and weeping in an anguish in which Florence had no part. And all of this filled Florence with terrible fear, which was immediately transformed into anger. "Gabriel can take care of you," she said, her voice shaking with malice. "Gabriel ain't never going to leave you. Is you, boy?" And she looked at him. He stood, stupid with bewilderment and grief, a few inches from the bed. "But me," she said, "I got to go." She walked to the center of the room again and picked up her bag. "Girl," Gabriel whispered, "ain't you got feelings at all?" "Lord," her mother cried, and at the sound her heart turned over. She and Gabriel, arrested, stared at the bed. "Lord, Lord, 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 have mercy on my sinful daughter. Stretch out your hand and hold her back from the lake that burns forever. Oh, my Lord, my Lord." And her voice dropped and broke, and tears ran down her face. "Lord, I done my best with all the children what you give me. Lord, have mercy on my children and my children's children." "Florence," said Gabriel, "please don't go. You ain't really fixing to go and leave her like this." Tears stood suddenly in her own eyes, though she could not have said what she was crying for. "Leave me be," she said to Gabriel, and picked up her bag again. She opened the door. The cold morning air came in. "Goodbye," she said, and then to Gabriel, "Tell her I said goodbye." She walked through the cabin door and down the short steps into the frosty yard. Gabriel watched her, standing frozen between the door and the weeping bed. Then, as her hand was on the gate, he ran before her and slammed the gate shut. "Girl, where you going? What you doing? You reckon on finding some men up north to dress you in pearls and diamonds?" Violently, she opened the gate and moved out into the road. He watched her with his jaw hanging and his lips loose and wet. "If you ever see me again," she said, "I won't be wearing rags like yours." All over the church there was only the sound, more awful than the deepest silence, of the prayers of the saints of God. Only the yellow, moaning light shone above them, making their faces gleam like muddy gold. Their faces and their attitudes, and their many voices rising as one voice made John think of the deepest valley, the longest night, of Peter and Paul in the dungeon cell, one praying while the other sang, or of endless, depthless, swelling water, and no dry land in sight, the true believer clinging to a spar, and thinking of tomorrow, when the church would rise up, singing under the booming Sunday light. He thought of the light for which they tarried, which in an instant filled the soul, causing throughout those iron-dark, unimaginable ages before John had come into the world, the newborn in Christ to testify, "Once I was blind and now I see." And then they sang, "Walk in the light, the beautiful light. Shine all around me by day and by night, Jesus, the light of the world." And they sang, "Oh Lord, Lord, I want to be ready. I want to be ready. I want to be ready to walk in Jerusalem just like John. To walk in Jerusalem just like John." Tonight, his mind was awash with visions. Nothing remained. He was ill with doubt and searching. He longed for a light that would teach him, forever and beyond all question, the way to go. For a power that would bind him, forever and beyond all crying, to the love of God. Or else he wished to stand up now, and leave this tabernacle and never see these people anymore. Fury and anguish filled him, unbearable, unanswerable. His mind was stretched to breaking, for it was time that filled his mind, time that was violent with the mysterious love of God. and his mind could not contain the terrible stretch of time that united 12 men fishing by the shores of Galilee, and black men weeping on their knees tonight, and he a witness. My soul is a witness for my Lord. There was an awful silence at the bottom of John's mind, a dreadful weight, a dreadful speculation, and not even a speculation, but a deep, deep turning, as of something huge, black, shapeless, for ages dead on the ocean floor, that now felt its rest disturbed by a faint, far wind, which bid it, arise. And this weight began to move at the bottom of John's mind, in a silence like the silence of the void before creation, and he began to feel a terror he had never felt before. And he looked around the church at the people praying there. Praying Mother Washington had not come in until all the saints were on their knees, and now she stood, the terrible old black, above his Aunt Florence, helping her to pray. Her granddaughter, Ella May, had come in with her, wearing a mangy fur jacket over her everyday clothes. She knelt heavily in a corner near the piano, under the sign that spoke of the wage of sin, and now and again she moaned. Elisha had not looked up when she came in, and he prayed in silence. Sweat stood on his brow. Sister McCandless and Sister Price cried out every now and again, "Yes, Lord," or "Bless your name, Jesus," and his father prayed, his head lifted up and his voice going on like a distant mountain stream. But his Aunt Florence was silent. He wondered if she slept. He had never seen her praying in a church before. He knew that different people prayed in different ways. Has his aunt always prayed in such a silence? His mother, too, was silent, but he had seen her pray before, and her silence made him feel that she was weeping. And why did she weep? And why did they come here, night after night, calling out to a God who cared nothing for them? If, above this flaking ceiling, there was any God at all, then he remembered that the fool has said in his heart, "There is no God," and he dropped his eyes, seeing that over his Aunt Florence's head praying Mother Washington was looking at him. Frank sang the blues and he drunk too much. His skin was the color of caramel candy. Perhaps for this reason she always thought of him as having candy in his mouth, candy staining the edges of his straight, cruel teeth. For a while he wore a tiny mustache, but she made him shave it off, for it made him look, she thought, like a half-breed gigolo. In details such as this he was always very easy. He would always put on a clean shirt or get his hair cut, or come with her to uplift meetings where they heard speeches by prominent Negroes about the future and duties of the Negro race. And this had given her, in the beginning of their marriage, the impression that she controlled him. This impression had been entirely and disastrously false. When he had left her, more than 20 years before, and after more than 10 years of marriage, she had felt for that moment only an exhausted exasperation and a vast relief. He had not been home for 2 days and 3 nights, and when he did return they quarreled with more than their usual bitterness. All of the rage she had accumulated during their marriage was told him in that evening as they stood in their small kitchen. He was still wearing overalls and he had not shaved, and his face was muddy with sweat and dirt. He had said nothing for a long while, and then he had said, "All right, baby. I guess you don't never want to see me no more. Not a miserable, black sinner like me." The door closed behind him, and she heard his feet echoing down the long hall, away. She stood alone in the kitchen, holding the empty coffee pot that she had been about to wash. She thought, "He'll come back, and he'll come back drunk." And then she had thought, looking about the kitchen, "Lord, wouldn't it be a blessing if he didn't never come back no more?" The Lord had given her what she said. She wanted, as was often, she had found, his bewildering method of answering prayer. Frank never did come back. He lived for a long while with another woman, and when the war came he died in France. Now, somewhere at the other end of the earth, her husband lay buried. He slept in a land his fathers had never seen. She wondered often if his grave was marked, if there stood over it, as in pictures she had seen, a small white cross. If the Lord had ever allowed her to cross that swelling ocean, she would have gone, among all the millions buried there, to seek out his grave. Wearing deep mourning, she would have laid on it, perhaps, a wreath of flowers as other women did, and stood for a moment head bowed, considering the unspeaking ground. How terrible it would be for Frank to rise on the day of judgment so far from home, and he surely would not scruple, even on that day, to be angry at the Lord. "Me and the Lord," he had often said, "don't always get along so well." He running the world like he thinks I ain't got good sense. How had he died? Slow or sudden? Had he cried out? Had death come creeping on him from behind, or faced him like a man? She knew nothing about it, for she had not known that he was dead until long afterwards, when boys were coming home and she had begun searching for Frank's face in the streets. It was the woman with whom he had lived who had told her, for Frank had given this woman's name as his next of kin. The woman, having told her, had not known what else to say, and she stared at Florence in simple-minded pity. This made Florence furious, and she barely murmured, "Thank you," before she turned away. She hated Frank for making this woman official witness to her humiliation, and she wondered again what Frank had seen in this woman, who, though she was younger than Florence, had never been so pretty, and who drank all the time and who was seen with many men. But it had been from the first her great mistake, to meet him, to marry him, to love him as she so bitterly had. Looking at his face, it sometimes came to her that all women had been cursed from the cradle. All, in one fashion or another, being given the same cruel destiny, born to suffer the weight of men. Frank claimed that she got it all wrong side up. It was men who suffered because they had to put up with the ways of women, and this from the time that they were born until the day they died. But it was she who was right, she knew. With Frank she had always been right, and it had not been her fault that Frank was the way he was, determined to live and die a common nigger. But he was always swearing that he would do better. It was, perhaps, the brutality of his penitence that had kept them together for so long. There was something in her which loved to see him bow, when he came home, stinking with whiskey, and crept with tears into her arms. Then he, so ultimately master, was mastered, and holding him in her arms while, finally, he slept, she thought with the sensations of luxury and power. But there's a lots of good in Frank. I just got to be patient and he'll come along all right. To come along meant that he would change his ways and consent to be the husband she had traveled so far to find. It was he who, unforgivably, taught her that there are people in the world for whom coming along is a perpetual process, people who are destined never to arrive. For 10 years he came along, but when he left her he was the same man she had married. He had not changed at all. He had never made enough money to buy the home she wanted, or anything else she really wanted, and this had been part of the trouble between them. It was not that he could not make money, but that he would not save it. He would take half a week's wages and go out and buy something he wanted or something he thought she wanted. He would come home on Saturday afternoons, already half drunk, with some useless objects, such a vase, which, it had occurred to him, she would like to fill with flowers, she who never noticed flowers and who would certainly never have bought any, or a hat, always too expensive or too vulgar, or a ring, that looked as though it had been designed for a whore. Sometimes it occurred to him to do the Saturday shopping on his way home so that she would not have to do it, in which case he would buy a turkey, the biggest and most expensive he could find, and several pounds of coffee, it being his belief that there was never enough in the house, and enough breakfast cereal to feed an army for a month. Such foresight always filled him with such a sense of his own virtue that, as a kind of reward, he would also buy himself a bottle of whiskey, and, lest she should think that he was drinking too much, invite some ruffian home to share it with him. Then they would sit all afternoon in her parlor, playing cards and telling indecent jokes, and making the air foul with whiskey and smoke. She would sit in the kitchen, cold with rage and staring at the turkey, which, since Frank always bought them unplucked and with the head on, would cost her hours of exasperating, bloody labor. Then she would wonder what on earth had possessed her to undergo such hard trial and travel so far from home. If all she had found was a 2-room apartment in a city she did not like, and a man yet more childish than any she had known when she was young, sometimes from the parlor where he and his visitor sat he would call her, "Hey, Flo," and she would not answer. She hated to be called Flo, but he never remembered. He might call her again, and when she did not answer he would come into the kitchen. "What's the matter with you, girl? Don't you hear me a-calling you?" And once when she still made no answer, but sat perfectly still, watching him with bitter eyes, he was forced to make verbal recognition that there was something wrong. "What's the matter, old lady? You mad at me?" And when in genuine bewilderment he stared at her, head to one side, the faintest of smiles on his face, something began to yield in her, something she fought, standing up and snarling at him in a lowered voice so that the visitor might not hear. "I wish you'd tell me just how you think we's going to live all week on a turkey and 5 pounds of coffee? Honey, I ain't bought nothing we didn't need." She sighed in helpless fury, and felt tears springing to her eyes. I done told you time and again to give me the money when you get paid and let me do the shopping. 'Cause you ain't got the sense that you was born with. Baby, I wasn't doing a thing in the world but trying to help you out. I thought maybe you wanted to go somewhere tonight and you didn't want to be bothered with no shopping. Next time you want to do me a favor, you tell me first, you hear? And how you expect me to go to a show when you done brought this bird home for me to clean? Honey, I'll clean it. It don't take no time at all. He moved to the table where the turkey lay and looked at it critically, as though he were seeing it for the first time. Then he looked at her and ginned. That ain't nothing to get mad about. She began to cry. I declare I don't know what gets into you. Every week the Lord sends you go out and do some foolishness. How do you expect us to get enough money to get away from here if you all the time going to be spending your money on foolishness? When she cried, he tried to comfort her, putting his great hand on her shoulder and kissing her where the tears fell. Baby, I'm sorry. I thought it'd be a nice surprise. The only surprise I want from you is to learn some sense. That'd be a surprise. You think I want to stay around here the rest of my life with these dirty niggers you all the time bring home? Where you expect us to live, honey? Where we ain't going to be with niggers? Then she turned away, looking out of the kitchen window. It faced an elevated train that passed so close she always felt that she might spit in the faces of the flying, staring people. I just don't like all that ragtag. Looks like you think so much of. Then there was silence. Although she had turned her back to him, she felt that he was no longer smiling and that his eyes, watching her, had darkened. And what kind of man you think you married? I thought I married a man with some get up and go to him, who didn't just want to stay on the bottom all his life. And what you want me to do, Florence? You want me to turn white? This question always filled her with an ecstasy of hatred. She turned and faced him, and, forgetting that there was someone sitting in the parlor, shouted, You ain't got to be white to have some self-respect. You reckon I slave in this house like I do so you and them common niggers can sit here every afternoon throwing ashes all over the floor. And who's common now, Florence? He asked, quietly, in the immediate and awful silence in which she recognized her error. Who's acting like a common nigger now? What you reckon my friend is sitting there a-thinking? I declare, I wouldn't be surprised none if he wasn't a-thinking. Poor Frank, he sure found him a common wife. Anyway, he ain't putting his ashes on the floor. He putting them in the ashtray, just like he knew what a ashtray was. She knew that she had hurt him, and that he was angry, by the habit he had at such a moment of running his tongue quickly and incessantly over his lower lip. But we's a-going now, so you can sweep up the parlor and sit there, if you want to, till the judgment day. And he left the kitchen. She heard murmurs in the parlor, and then the slamming of the door. She remembered, too late, that he had all his money with him. When he came back, long after nightfall, and she put him to bed and went through his pockets, she found nothing or almost nothing, and she sank helplessly to the parlor floor and cried. When he came back at times like this he would be petulant and penitent. She would not creep into bed until she thought that he was sleeping. But he would not be sleeping. He would turn as she stretched her legs beneath the blankets, and his arm would reach out, and his breath would be hot and sour sweet in her face. Sugar plum, what you want to be so evil with your baby for? Don't you know you done made me go out and get drunk, and I wasn't a-fixing to do that? I wanted to take you out somewhere tonight. And while he spoke, his hand was on her breast, and his moving lips brushed her neck. And this caused such a war in her as could scarcely be endured. She felt that everything in existence between them was part of a mighty plan for her humiliation. She did not want his touch, and yet she did. She burned with longing and froze with rage. And she felt that he knew this and inwardly smiled to see how easily, on this part of the battlefield, his victory could be assured. But at the same time she felt that his tenderness, his passion, and his love were real. Let me alone, Frank. I want to go to sleep. No, you don't. You don't want to go to sleep so soon. You want me to talk to you a little. You know how your baby loves to talk. Listen. And he brushed her neck lightly with his tongue. You hear that? He waited. She was silent. Ain't you got nothing more to say than that? I better tell you something else. And then he covered her face with kisses. Her face, neck, arms, and breasts. You stink of whiskey. Let me alone. Ah, I ain't the only one got a tongue. What you got to say to this? and his hand stroked the inside of her thigh. Stop. I ain't going to stop. This is sweet talk, baby. 10 years. Their battle never ended. They never bought a home. He died in France. Tonight she remembered details of those years which she thought she had forgotten, and at last she felt the stony ground of her heart break up, and tears, as difficult and slow as blood, began to trickle through her fingers. This the old woman above her somehow divined, and she cried, "Yes, honey, you just let go, honey. Let him bring you low so he can raise you up." And was this the way she should have gone? Had she been wrong to fight so hard? Now she was an old woman and all alone, and she was going to die. And she had nothing for all her battles. It had all come to this. She was on her face before the altar, crying to God for mercy. Behind her she heard Gabriel cry, "Bless your name, Jesus!" And, thinking of him and the high road of holiness he had traveled, her mind swung like a needle, and she thought of Deborah. Deborah had written her, not many times, but in a rhythm that seemed to remark each crisis in her life with Gabriel. And once, during the time she and Frank were still together, she had received from Deborah a letter that she had still. It was locked tonight in her handbag, which lay on the altar. She had always meant to show this letter to Gabriel one day, but she never had. She had talked with Frank about it late one night while he lay in bed whistling some ragtag tune, and she sat before the mirror and rubbed bleaching cream into her skin. The letter lay open before her, and she sighed loudly to attract Frank's attention. He stopped whistling in the middle of a phrase. Mentally, she finished it. "What you got there, sugar?" he asked lazily. "It's a letter from my brother's wife." She stared at her face in the mirror, thinking angrily that all these skin creams were a waste of money. They never did any good. "What's them niggers doing down home? It ain't no bad news, is it?" Still he hummed, irrepressibly, deep in his throat. "No, well, it ain't no good news neither, but it ain't nothing to surprise me none. She says she think my brother's got a bastard living right there in the same town what he's scared to call his own. No? And I thought you said you brother was a preacher. Being a preacher ain't never stopped a nigger from doing his dirt." Then he laughed. "You sure don't love your brother like you should. How come his wife found out about this kid?" She picked up the letter and turned to face him. "Sound to me like she been knowing about it, but she ain't never had the nerve to say nothing." She paused, then added, reluctantly, "Of course, she ain't really what you might call sure, but she ain't a woman to go around thinking things. She mighty worried. Hell, what's she worried about it now for? Can't nothing be done about it now? She wonder if she ought to ask him about it. And do she reckon if she ask him, he going to be fool enough to say yes?" She sighed again, more genuinely this time, and turned back to the mirror. "Well, he's a preacher. And if Deborah's right, he ain't got not right to be a preacher. He ain't no better 'en nobody else. In fact, he ain't no better than a murderer." He had begun to whistle again. He stopped. "Murderer? How so?" "Because he done let this child's mother go off and die when the child was born. That's how so." She paused. "And it sounds just like Gabriel. He ain't never thought a minute about nobody in this world but himself." He said nothing, watching her implacable back. Then, "You going to answer this letter?" "I reckon. And what you going to say?" "I'm going to tell her she ought to let him know she know about his wickedness. Get up in front of the congregation and tell them too, if she has to." He stirred restlessly and frowned. "Well, you know more about it than me. But I don't see where that's going to do no good. It'll do her some good. It'll make him treat her better. You don't know my brother like I do. There ain't but one way to get along with him. You got to scare him half to death. That's all. He ain't got no right to go around running his mouth about how holy he is if he done turned a trick like that." There was silence. He whistled again a few bars of his song, and then he yawned and said, "Is you coming to bed, old lady? Don't know why you keep wasting all your time and my money on all them old skin whiteners. You as black now as you was the day you was born. You wasn't there the day I was born. And I know you don't want a coal-black woman." But she rose from the mirror and moved toward the bed. "I ain't never said nothing like that. You just kindly turn out that light and I'll make you to know that black's a mighty pretty color." She wondered if Deborah had ever spoken, and she wondered if she would give Gabriel the letter that she carried in her handbag tonight. She had held it all these years, awaiting some savage opportunity. What this opportunity would have been she did not. At this moment she did not want to know, for she had always thought of this letter as an instrument in her hands which could be used to complete her brother's destruction. When he was completely cast down, she would prevent him from ever rising again by holding before him the evidence of his blood guilt. But now she thought she would not live to see this patiently awaited day. She was going to be cut down, and the thought filled her with terror and rage. The tears dried on her face and the heart within her shook, divided between a terrible longing to surrender and a desire to call God into account. Why had he preferred her mother and her brother, the old black woman and the low black man, while she, who had sought only to walk upright, was come to die, alone and in poverty, in a dirty, furnished room? She beat her fists heavily against the altar. He would live, and smiling, watch her go down into the grave, and her mother would be there, leaning over the gates of heaven, to see her daughter burning in the pit. As she beat her fists on the altar, the old woman above her laid hands on her shoulders, crying, "Call on him, daughter! Call."
Oh, nice. So let's make a... Okay, okay.
Match found.
Non, ça. Voilà. Allah. Let's go. Let's go.
Move or get zapped.